like to call to order the study session for the City Council for the City of Wheat Ridge, Colorado for April 15, 2019. Thank you all for being here. We will start our meeting with citizens' right to speak, and you may speak on any item on the agenda for 3 minutes. And our first speaker is Tanya Cardwell and Ron Cardwell on deck. And if you would please come to the podium and adjust the microphone so it fits you. Give us your first name and your last name, and if you'd spell your last name and give us your address, we'll be set to go.
Hi there. Tanya Cardwell. It's Cardwell, and address is 1835 South Vallejo Street, Denver 80223. Also, with your permission, I would like to borrow 1 minute from another speaker, Christopher Heydrich.
If they desire to give that to you, that would be fine.
Okay, pretty sure he does.
Okay.
There we go, thumbs up. And then I also have notes to give to the clerk. Christy advised me to give them to the clerk, who I'm assuming, are you? Right,
yes, this is our clerk here.
Okay, great. Yeah, so there also should be a couple of letters from other dog businesses that are being handed out to City Council. All right. All right, so just to put it on the table, what we're hoping to propose is to amend zoning, particularly for commercial zones, to change C1 and C2 to allow outdoor enclosed dog spaces, either for all of zoning or potentially just with a special use permit. So what I'd like to present is giving a little bit of history on what is going on with Denver Metro's economy and how that's influencing the supply of properties in both industrial, agriculture, and commercial properties. So just to be clear, as zoning stands right now, outdoor enclosed dog spaces are allowed in industrial zones and agriculture zones. They're not allowed in commercial zones. So up until about 5-6 years ago, that wasn't so much of a problem. There were many more properties to choose from. But super quickly, our economy has been evolving and morphing, and our supply of those options has gone down, while commercial venues has either stagnated or the availability has actually gone up. So my understanding is we have a lot of developers coming in to Colorado, buying up industrial and agricultural space, leveling them to the ground, rezoning them for residential, and then building up properties. So a lot of these cranes, a lot of the development you see used to be agriculture and industrial, where dog companies used to be able to set up shop. So basically, super, super quickly, that supply has, each year, it's gone down, which has driven the prices up immensely. So at the same time, while this is going on, we have available commercial venues. So that's, like I was saying, seems to be, if not stagnant, you've probably noticed a lot more for lease signs, for sale signs, and if you look up those properties, they are zoned commercial. So this is just a theory that I understand. It's also in talking with my real estate agent, but he was saying that brick and mortar retail is slowly crumbling and giving way to online retail, Amazon. So every single year, more and more people are buying on Amazon Prime. They're not going to brick and mortar stores. So this is why you see, sadly, a lot of those businesses slowly going out of business. So by changing zoning to allow dog companies to come in, we can start to fill up all those empty spaces because there definitely is a very, very high demand for dog businesses in Colorado. So another relevant variable. Oh, I realize I don't see if I'm on time or not. Okay, there's the green button. Thank you.
Now you're on 1 minute.
Okay, got it. So another relevant variable is about 5 years, Denver Metro made marijuana legal, and a lot of the grow houses have to go into industrial zoned properties. So we already have a lot of them being leveled and taken out of the market, and then the few that are remaining are now filled with grow houses. So there was already a really limited supply, and now there's even less of a supply. So yes, just in conclusion, I would love it if we could amend commercial zoning, C1 and C2, to allow outdoor enclosed dog spaces, either on its own or with a special use permit. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Ron Cardwell and Christopher Heydrich on deck.
Hi, my name is Ron Cardwell, last name Cardwell. My address is 1835 South Vallejo Street, Denver, 80223. I'm also here to speak in support of amending the commercial zoning for C1 and C2 to allow outdoor enclosed spaces for dogs, either in the total zone district or as a special use permit. I'd like to address a couple of concerns that may be on your minds, which is barking dogs and smell. Both of those concerns are addressed through animal control and PACFA, which is the Colorado Department of Agriculture department that deals with licensing these facilities already. Animal control is an expert in addressing these situations. The Wheat Ridge Animal Control, there's an order of escalation when they get a complaint. They get a complaint for a barking dog or a smell. They address that complaint, they visit, they issue a warning, and they provide education in how to stop the barking dogs or how to control the smell. If that circumstance is ignored, then they come back. 2 neighbors at that point have to have complained, so it's not just a repetitive one neighbor issue that, you know, there may be an issue between that neighbor and the business or something, but it's an escalation for animal control. They have to have a time and date of barking or smell, whatever, and then animal control issues a summons to appear in court at that point. Then the court issues a fine or some other appropriate punishment. The Department of Agriculture with PACFA also regulates the sanitation and safety of these businesses. They give unannounced inspections at least once a year. They have strict rules on how to sanitize and which cleaning agents these businesses have to use, and are very strict in how they ensure that. That ensures contagion and smells are non-issues. PACFA also does not permit dogs to be outside that are not related to each other. So if 2 dogs are brought in and they're from the same family, they can be left unattended. But if they're from several different households, those dogs are not allowed to be left unattended ever. So that would alleviate some of the barking dog issues as well. Generally, barking dog complaints come from dogs being left outside unattended by themselves, which wouldn't be an issue because PACFA prohibits that. In conclusion, the concerns of barking dogs and smells are already addressed through other governmental agencies, so it shouldn't be an issue to change the zoning to allow these businesses to operate with outdoor spaces. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Christopher Heydrich and Paul Westman on deck.
Good evening. I'm Christopher Heydrich, and that's Heidrich. I live at 1655 Pierce Street, Lakewood, Colorado, 80214, and I'm here in support of the zoning change for the animal training facilities. And I am specifically here tonight to echo the words of Carrie Solberg, who is an owner behaviorist of Canine State of Mind in Parker, Colorado. And she states, "My name is Carrie Solberg, and I own K9 State of Mind LLC in Parker, Colorado. I operate a 5,020 square foot dog training boarding daycare facility, and consequently am well versed in zoning requirements and special permitting process required in most towns in the state of Colorado. It is because of this knowledge and experience that I have taken an interest in the council's reviewing of the town's policies regarding dog facilities. As an owner of a quickly growing business, my attention is always looking forward to next steps for potential growth and expansion. In any business, expansion requires due diligence around many areas of business, but in the pet care industry, that due diligence can often negate a long list of potential locations. Because of my experience in locating my current facility in Parker, my first step in the research process is now to look at a town's zoning requirements and weigh how amenable a town will be towards my incoming business. The ability to have an outdoor space for my business is essential in the day-to-day operations. It facilitates a cleaner facility, provides for more training and enrichment space, and allows the dogs to be more relaxed. Additionally, potential clients are quickly turned off at the idea of a dog facility with no outdoor area. Considering these things, I believe it would be in the town's interest to consider changing the zoning for commercial zones C1 and C2 so that businesses may be allowed to have outdoor enclosed spaces for dogs under a use by special review permit. By opening the ability for dog businesses to fill vacant commercial buildings they previously couldn't, you'll invite many small businesses eager to grow deeper into an ever-expanding pet market and become a beneficial part of the town's economy. Thank you for your consideration tonight.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Paul Westman and Julie McLean on deck.
Hi, my name is Paul Westman, last name Westman, and I live at 2335 South Race Street, apartment 105, Denver, Colorado, 80210. So I'd like to begin by reading a letter from Zia Moranto at Muddy Paws to the Wheat Ridge Council. Thank you for considering a change in how business owners are able to use outside enclosed spaces for dogs. As a business owner of Muddy Paws Bathhouse for over 13 years, I've been fortunate to be able to expand my business from a self-serve dog wash to offering pet grooming and more recently to include a pet store. As a result of this expansion, I have employed more people, purchased more products, increased my capital, and certainly generated increased tax revenue for Wheat Ridge. Plus, the community loves us. This increase in growth came about as a result of moving my business from Denver to Wheat Ridge, where I was able to purchase a building that fills my current needs. However, this change would provide me with additional business options and would certainly increase the viability of my building for resale. In 1998, I created Denver Fidos, an organization that worked towards the creation of off-leash dog parks. We were successful. I point this out because through this experience, I came to understand the importance of taking into consideration the concerns of residents. I also came to realize how intuitive pet business owners must be to their surrounding environment and others who may not be pet enthusiasts. I believe with your guidance and support, this change will be a win for the community, business owners, and Wheat Ridge in general. Thank you, Zia Moranto with Muddy Paws. So I'd also like to take the last half of my time to address what this would mean for the community in terms of safety. In my professional life, I'm a preparedness program administrator for the American Red Cross, and as a result of having access to high quality and affordable dog training in the community at a greater level than is currently possible because of the zoning laws, the community would be safer. Children would be safer. There would be more trained dogs on the street. A topical Google search will show you that Colorado is one of the #1 states for dog ownership in the United States. By adding the ability to give citizens of Wheat Ridge access to affordable and high-quality dog training, you would increase safety. In addition to this, I have spoken with my associates who have spoken tonight, as well as others who are potentially seeking to come to Wheat Ridge. And we are also in the process of looking to do a community-based dog safety class. So that way, not only are we benefiting the community in terms of providing dog training, but also providing a service to keep the community safe and keep the community happy. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Julie McLean and Missy Eyre on deck.
Hi, I'm Julie McLean, Juliemclean, and my address is 3335 Zephyr Court, Wheat Ridge, Colorado, 80033. I'm here today to be in support of the same thing that the last few speakers were, to amend or update Wheat Ridge zoning code to allow C1 and C2 to be eligible for outdoor off-leash secured areas for dogs. Currently, outdoor enclosed dog spaces are only available in industrial and agricultural with special use permit. So why update the zoning? The current code is outdated. Wheat Ridge already has so much going for it with all the revitalization happening in the city. One thing it is missing is keeping up with the current dog care market and what dog owners want. They want their dogs treated more like family members, and they want good habits for them, such as playing outside and going to the bathroom outside. Lakewood updated their commercial zoning many years ago and currently allows outdoor enclosed areas for dogs with permitted use. Lakewood is currently a very desirable city to open a dog care facility. Wheat Ridge should join them. We were told one of the reasons it is prohibited is due to noise and smell. Wheat Ridge has animal control, which addresses noise concerns, and facilities would be held accountable for any noise complaints. As already addressed previously, PACFA is another avenue that would address proper hygiene and noise and keep neighbors happy. Wheat Ridge also currently has its own kennel license, which double checks that PACFA rules are being followed. There are many dog bite cases in Wheat Ridge Court on a monthly basis. Zen Doggy Den has been dealing with a lot of those cases and helping the owners and their dogs. The more training-based facilities in Wheat Ridge, the safer the community will be. The dogs deserve a chance, and owners deserve small business options to guide them to better dog ownership. Industrial buildings just aren't good enough. Effective dog training revolves around real-world opportunities. It doesn't make sense for us to open facilities in warehouses. We want to simulate a home environment, and I'm pretty sure most of you don't live in a warehouse. Industrial and agricultural locations lack the offerings you can get in a commercial zone, such as pedestrians, dogs being walked, cars, bikes, children, and other everyday distractions. There is also the retail potential. Being located in a more desirable commercial location allows more potential for retail sales, which will further benefit the city. Consumers' expectations have increased. Consumers want to bring their fur babies in warm, inviting spaces, not cold, dungeon-like industrial spaces. Commercial properties offer a friendly, personal feel. Owners are often turning to things like Rover.com, which for those of you that don't know is like an Uber for dog services, but this is out of residential homes. And unfortunately, it's often with people that are not professionals. Owners want more of a home-like environment. They need more options and places that will give their dogs specialized care and treat them more like family members than animals to be left in a cement run. Please make Wheat Ridge part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Missy Eyre.
Hello, my name is Missy, last name A-H-R. I live at 8370 West 87th Drive, and I'm here speaking in Arvada, 80005. I'm here speaking about the Anderson Building. For the last 50 years, Jazzercise has been around. It's a franchise that I've owned and teach. I haven't been teaching it for 50 years, but it's been around for 50 years. We've been renting the Anderson Building for the last 30 years, and we were really excited for the facelift that was happening. Unfortunately, in January, we were told that we were no longer allowed to rent the space. Many of my customers reached out to you guys and got me in contact with Joyce and Jim Spalding, who have written a lease agreement that is just so hard to sign. We're being charged more in rent, which I get that was coming with the new rental, but we're not allowed storage or to be there and be a community. Usually we got 30 minutes before class and 30 minutes after class to help kind of set up and tuck away things. And we're not even allowed that. We're getting 15 minutes before class and 15 minutes after class. And to haul a sound system and get it set up and get people checked in, normally we have about 30 to 40 people in class, and that's a lot to get signed up and get ready for a class to go. And we were even allowed to use the drinking fountain. That was part of the lease, was we're allowed to use the drinking fountain. So I'm not ready to sign it yet, but I was just wondering why Joyce is asking for more money, yet she won't have renters in there who want to rent the space. So I'm here, I'm still willing to rent the space, but I'd like to maybe have you guys have my back, see if Joyce will give us a little bit more time in the Anderson building. Thank you again for your time. That's it.
Thank you. That's all the speakers I have signed up on our speakers list, but it's not too late. If you would like to speak on any item that is on the agenda, you may come forward now and speak. Is there anyone who hasn't signed up who would like to speak? Okay, I don't see anybody moving to the podium, so we will close our citizens' right to speak and move on to our first agenda item, which is the Regency Sales Tax TIF agreement. And I believe we have a presentation by Mr. Art.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor and members of the council. The Applewood Shopping Center has been providing some great retail, our largest shopping center in the Wheat Ridge area, for decades. As you know, in July of 2017, the Walmart building shuttered its operations in Wheat Ridge. As we learned about the closure of the Walmart store, the city reached out to Regency. Regency is the owner-operator of the center, about what they plan to do with the shopping center. At that time, they weren't quite sure exactly what was going to occur with that closed building. It took them about a year to go out and identify new users for that building. At that time, they have identified 4 new users at that site there. And tonight with us is Will Damreth from Regency Centers. And at that time, then when they identified 4 new users, they realized they had to repurpose that building. So if you drive by there, you can see that they took down the entire facade of that building and started rebuilding it and identified some cost overruns. Additionally, they desired to redo that whole parking lot in front of Walmart and some public improvements that the city desired on Youngfield, 38th Avenue on the exterior with that. And with this, I'd like to turn it over to Will Damreth of Regency Centers. Oh, thank you, Patrick. Is that loud? Oh. So Will Damreth is Vice President at Regency Centers, and he is going to detail their plans for the shopping center and specifically the Walmart building.
Council members and staff, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak tonight. My name is Will Damrath, W-I-L-L-D-A-M-R-A-T-H. Address is 8480 East Orchard Road in Greenwood Village, Colorado. I'm the Vice President Market Officer for Regency Centers Rocky Mountain region, and just wanted to give a very brief overview of who we are. Regency Centers is a real estate investment trust. We're a publicly traded REIT on the New York Stock Exchange. We own about 425 shopping centers across the U.S. And in Colorado, I'm in charge of 21 properties, one of which is Applewood Village in Wheat Ridge. We purchased this property in partnership in 2005, and at the time, we did not own all the contiguous properties at the shopping center. Let me jump ahead. This is a site plan for context, and I've colored it in a few different colors. There's some orange buildings, some tan, and some light green areas that I'll go through. Back in 2005, the orange building in the bottom right, which is now a new Starbucks, was 2 different parcels, a vacant gas station and a vacant retail building that was purchased by Longs Peak Metro District. I worked for a couple of years to acquire those properties as we owned the property around and contiguous with it. Also, up in the top right in orange, that's the King Soopers Fuel Center, We also did not own all of that property. Wells Fargo owned the green area, which was a parking lot for their back office employees for a bank location they had at this center. So we acquired that. The tan building just to the left of that was owned by Jerry Beal, who redeveloped and owned the center for many years. We acquired that as well. And then the last orange rectangle at the bottom of the page in the middle is the location of the new Hacienda restaurant that's being built today. That was owned by Wells Fargo Bank. We acquired that parcel. So today we own every contiguous piece of land on this drawing with the exception of the far left rectangle in the front, which is the mattress firm. I'm sorry, thank you, Patrick. Right here. That's the last piece in this drawing that we don't own. There's a private investor in California that owns that two-tenant building. Long term, we'd like to find a way to purchase that from him. But as you can see, we've had a lot of history and a lot of things going on at the property. Why do we want to own all the property? Regency's business model and our partnership, who we own this asset with, is a lot of pension fund investors, not unlike your retirement money. They invest in our stock. We have a very conservative, long-term outlook on retail. One of the speakers did mention the dynamic of Amazon and retail shrinking. That's absolutely true. It's something that for the last 5 years we've been extremely focused on. And part of that focus is to increase placemaking at our shopping centers, make them more appealing through good merchandising, pick the best-in-class retailers that are going to be more resistant to internet sales, and definitely I think you're going to see a reduction in brick-and-mortar retailer. It's a reality. We have a very solid strategy, a long-term strategy in place to have the best shopping centers that will sustain that test of time. Part and parcel to that strategy is to attract retailers like Hacienda. That was really one of the first leases stepping in that direction to re-merchandise Applewood Village. We're very excited about that. We're very excited about the assistance and work that we did with the city to bring that deal to the table. We also had inherited, if you will, a 50-year-old shopping center with fractured ownership, and a lot of the circulation throughout the center, a lot of the infrastructure was obsolete and blighted and failing. So we're faced with a huge investment, and we're very bullish about that investment at Applewood Village. Moving down to Walmart, we knew that Walmart ultimately would leave the center. Their sales had been declining year over year, but when they actually sent us a letter and said we're closing the store, that took us by surprise. So at the time, the Clear Creek Crossing project and our project had been on the market to prospective tenants. And initially, we felt like there was about 250,000 square feet of retail interest at the shopping center, and the Walmart was about 137,000 square feet. So we felt pretty good that we'd be able to find retailers. With that competing project across the street and that brick and mortar Amazon dynamic, and if you aren't familiar, there are certain retailers that don't like other types of retailers next to them. For example, a big fitness gym requires a unique parking load that a lot of retailers, soft goods retailers, grocery retailers don't like a fitness facility near them. So a long story short, we found out of that 250,000 square feet, some were interested across the street, some were not interested in co-tenanting in the Walmart box. We were lucky to have about 90 to 100,000 square feet of interest. When we started putting numbers together for this project, I was touring with our chairman and sitting out in the parking lot in front of a vacant Walmart. And he said, "Will, how much do you think it's going to cost to re-tenant this building?" And I've done this in many different communities at our centers, redeveloped quite a few. I said, Hap, I think it's probably $8 to $12 million. My project manager sat next to me and said, I think you're low, Will. Well, fast forward to today, that project is approaching $20 million. And that's for a lot of reasons I won't go into. The market, the construction costs in the market are extremely, the increases are extremely high. But probably the biggest one was the failing infrastructure at Applewood Village. The building was 47 years old, and you really can't attract those type of best-in-class retailers or do what the city would like to see and this community would like to see without spending a lot of money and making it look right for the long term. So suffice it to say that does not meet, investing that kind of capital with very few players in the market rents really did not support our investment criteria for returns on a project like this. Nevertheless, through discussions with city and Clear Creek Crossing, one of the best things that happened was the announcement of the hospital. What that did for us was, and I believe it will do long term for this intersection, is create a lot of daytime employment, which is critical for retail. A lot of critical mass. We've always been competing with Denver West to create a lot of critical mass here to get the best in class retailers. So that was one step that was very positive. What it also did was take some space out of the Clear Creek Crossing project and allow them to then target retailers that we were not going to be able to put in the Walmart building. It's very infrequent where two development sites right across the street from each other aren't competing directly, but I give credit to Patrick and the city for kind of navigating through some of those discussions, through giving us some advice and planning for the Clear Creek Crossing project. I believe it's the best of both worlds today. Applewood Village traditionally has generated about 65% of the sales tax revenue for the city. We believe that can grow over time with this merchandising mix. To date, we've got leases signed with Hobby Lobby on the far left, Home Goods next to them, and Sierra Trading Post, which are TJ Maxx company concepts. Home Goods is homewares, really, really popular concept today. Sierra Trading Post is like an REI, but more of a price point REI type retailer. So we're really excited about that. And then Ulta Cosmetics next to them. So with that, I wanted to give an idea of the quality of the architecture. Again, working with staff and some of the requirements that they wanted to see for this facade, it's like night and day. The bar joists in this building were like a small 1950s retail building, so we've had to rip off the entire front of the building and put new structural steel in just to create these entries and support the new snow loads. There's the front entry of the Sierra, Ulta, and then Home Goods on the far left there. And then this is just a quick call out of all of the public infrastructure that was required, part and parcel to just the work to the building. So the highlighted blue and green areas are traffic and street front improvements along Youngfield, around the corner in orange, and then in purple, the improvements along 38th will be undergrounding utilities, redoing those tree lawns and streetscape all the way along the frontage road. The site, in order to drain and create water quality control for new drainage, has to be repaved, and then we had to split the building and create 4 new docks for those retailers. So those are some of the highlights that added to the cost of the project. I've been cautioned that some of these numbers are slightly different, and I'll explain why, but basically, we said, we've got a problem, city, can you help? We want to keep this shopping center vibrant and producing sales tax for the next 20, 30 years. Is there anything or any tools or incentives that are available to help us? And this was a list of under the code, improvements that are eligible for cities and urban renewal boards to participate in. Through negotiations and meetings with urban renewal in the city, my number is 5.9 here. Obviously, you'll hear later from Tim and the city that we've agreed to drop several of these costs in order to try and come to some sort of support and agreement. The biggest one here is facade upgrades to meet city planning standards. We've dropped that in half, and we've agreed to cap our request to below this $5.1 million. What I want to show here, we had some choices. One of the questions you might ask is, why should you guys help now? We've already started and made the decision to invest this money. Up until very recently, and actually still today, we haven't turned over space to any of these tenants yet. We're still under construction. There were other retailers that didn't compete with Clear Creek Crossing that did express interest in just moving into the building for a fraction of the cost. One of those was a retailer named At Home. And what we did is this is some proprietary data that we purchase. It's customer trip data from retail spaces. So what you see on the bottom is they're called demand lines. And so what's interesting about the very similar lineup to At Home, Home Goods, and Ulta is a shopping center on Wadsworth in blue. And those big, thick, dark lines show more trips in that direction. The blue star up at the top is an At-Home retailer, and their demand lines draw from a broader area, but they're not as thick and dark. So what that means in reality when you look at the per square foot sales and the sales tax generating from that kind of lineup versus an At-Home is it's substantially more for the type of lineup that we are moving forward with at Applewood Village. However, that decision financially for Regency would have been much better. It would have cost a lot less. They would have paid more rent. But through what we view as a partnership with Wheat Ridge on this shopping center, we were hoping that we would be able to get some sort of incentive to help defray the costs. What you'll see in orange there, that's Applewood Village today. So strong demand lines we pull from as far as Evergreen. If you were to see Denver West on here, you'd see bigger, thicker lines. So what we're hoping to do is to add the demand lines from the bottom blue star to the red at Applewood Village. And long term, Tim can talk about some of the models your consultant did for this proposed revenue generation over the next 20 years. And we feel very, very confident in our strategy. So I respectfully request support for our incentive request, and glad to answer any questions now or at the end.
Thank you very much, Will. So that's the development that's going on, and as I said, it took them about a year to identify these users, and they did, as Will told you, they did approach the city and the Urban Renewal Authority about assisting with the project, and immediately we engaged economic and planning systems to help us work through the pro forma and the but-for proposition in there. So they've been working for about the last 6 months on this, really honing down on the cost and that, and I'd like to introduce, who's going to go up first, Andrew? Andrew Knudsen, a principal at EPS, who will talk about a portion of it and then turn it over to Tim Morzell.
Mr. Mayor, if you will excuse me for just a moment.
I'm sorry.
If you will excuse me for just a moment, I'll return.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Mayor, members of council, Andrew Knudsen and Tim Morzell with Economic and Planning Systems. We are here to help the City Council and previously the URA understand the request relative to the metrics of project performance and fiscal benefit. In terms of the purpose tonight, we've got a request from Regency for sales tax and property tax. Number two, the URA did review this. We were at that meeting March 19th. And three, what we're planning to do tonight is to give an overview of the project as well as the request for TIF. Economic and Planning Systems is a third-party analyst. We bring that third-party independent perspective to a number of URAs. We're working with about a dozen right now throughout the state. We are a land use economics consulting firm, and we do, as part of our work, specialize in the technical analysis around real estate returns and financing. Just want to emphasize that we are working for the city. Our contract is for actually technically the URA, but it's the public sector that we are interested in. The developer does pay the invoices, but the contract is with the city, and we often work in this intersection between public and private. And what we have been doing, the Denver office has been open for about 20 years, and what we've been doing over this time frame is specializing in incremental and transparent. And those two features enable us to gather either side, the public and the private, and figure out terms that are credible and beneficial to both. And with that, my colleague Tim, here's our office and our lines of business, of which public finance is just one, but we also underpin our assumptions around our public financing models with market research, and we're particularly close to market research and understand how to load models with good relevant inputs. Anyway, those are the rest of the lines of business, but at this point, Tim will walk through the specific request.
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you for having us here this evening. We just wanted to touch on a couple of key components of this project and this request. And I'll just start off with a high-level overview of the program. As Will mentioned, it's a redevelopment of just this portion at West 38th and Youngfield, just this portion of the Applewood Village Center. It's roughly 126,000 square feet that we're talking about. The current tenant lineup includes Hobby Lobby, Home Goods, Sierra Trading Post, and Ulta. In total, redevelopment costs are currently estimated at just over $20 million. Also want to point out that we are including this pad as a component of our analysis and accounting for some sort of retail user occupying that space in the next few years. The project's in the I-70 and Kipling urban renewal area. The purpose of that plan and the authority is to reduce, eliminate, and prevent the spread of blight within the area and to stimulate growth and investment within area boundaries. To do that, they have a number of financing mechanisms available to them. One of those is property tax increment. The other is sales tax increment. The city, through the cooperation agreement the city has with the URA, needs to sign off on any agreements to share sales tax. And so that's what we're specifically talking about tonight. And this plan area was approved December 2015 and has a 25-year TIF clock, so it expires at the end of 2040. Quick map, or quick description of a map showing the plan area and the project location to the left there. And so with that, I'll go into the criteria that we use when we're evaluating these types of projects. There's really three primary tests that we evaluate and look to. The first is an evaluation of eligible costs. Those are costs that represent some sort of public improvement. There's both the legal requirement for those and also the URA's requirement in terms of what they're willing to invest in and fund. The second is our evaluation of developer return. That's our but-for test, ensuring that but for the investment of public revenues, this project would not be feasible. And the third is ensuring that there's adequate amount of public revenues that the project generates in order to fill any gap that we've identified. So moving on to that first test, eligible costs. Will went through a few of these. These are really site costs for the most part, facade improvements. They represent improvements that have a public benefit. They include improving the parking lot, streetscape, curb and gutter, some facade improvements. As Will mentioned, we spent a good deal of time looking at these in great detail and decided to bring down some of the facade improvements that the URA and the city would be funding, with the thinking that as part of the general costs associated with owning a center, they should be responsible for some of those as well. So in total, we estimated those costs at just over $5.3 million. So that's our first test that is going to potentially limit the amount of TIF revenues a project receives. The second test is going to be our developer returns, or but-for analysis. For this, we generally rely on an evaluation of return on cost. That's essentially a calculation looking at net operating income over total cost. We do also look at the project's IRR on an unleveraged basis, so without accounting for the split between debt and equity. In this case, we've relied on the return on cost metric, and for that, we identified a hurdle rate of 6.75, which we think represents the level of risk associated with this project and this type of a development, being more retail and commercial oriented. So this slide summarizes how we calculate the project gap based on that return on cost hurdle. We take total project costs, that includes everything, the vertical construction, infrastructure, site work, soft costs, architecture and engineering, and we compare those to the project's estimated stabilized net operating income and anticipated vacancy rates. So in this case, we're assuming net operating income of $9 a square foot, or actually a rental rate of $9 a square foot, which is supported by LOIs the developer has, letters of intent, essentially an indication from potential tenants stating what they're willing to pay for this space. And that's really one of the main limiting factors in terms of what drives the gap at this location. So based on those two factors and the hurdle rate of 6.75, we estimate a project gap of $4.88 million roughly in order to bring the project up to that 6.75 hurdle rate. So in this case, the limiting factor is going to be that $4.88 million and not the amount of eligible costs that are associated with this project. So moving on to the amount of public revenues that the project generates and are available to be shared with the project. We have accounted for property tax. The URA agreed to share 100% of property tax through 2040 with the project. Roughly $3.25 million is the present value of those revenues, and so there's a remaining $1.63 million that would be needed to be closed by another source. In this case, we've considered sales tax as a potential gap closure strategy. And for the purpose of this analysis, we've looked at 1% through 2025 out of the total city tax rate of 3.5%. Just briefly looking at the amount of sales tax that we're estimating just this component of the project to generate, so just this component of Applewood Village, just the redeveloped portion. Average annual sales tax revenue of $1.35 million through 2040, increasing from just under $1 million to just under $2 million in 2040. Total revenue of $31 million through 2040. And again, this is really just the redeveloped portion of the center. The other portions of the center will also continue to generate sales tax. And Will mentioned this. We did look at a number of scenarios in terms of how the redevelopment of this section of the site influences other areas in the center. Just the investment in this section, the quality of the tenants that we're thinking about at this point has the potential to increase the performance of the retails throughout the center. And just roughly estimating a 5% increase in sales from those tenants, that has the potential to increase city sales tax by $160,000 per year, or $3.7 million through 2040. Before we get into the amount of sales tax that could be used to close the gap, we wanted to quickly talk about the difference between the nominal value of those revenues and the real value of those revenues. And so in our analysis, we really account for both. But in determining the gap, the amount of revenues required in today's dollars or the gap closure. We use the present value of the future public revenues. And we do that for a number of reasons. The first is a consideration of what those, what the city would be able to lend if it were to take out a loan, and the interest rate it would need to pay on that debt, which is roughly 5%. The second is accounting for the fact that the developer also needs to fund these improvements through a combination of debt and equity, and typically the cost of debt that a developer is going to be able to take out is going to be over 5%. And then it's also important to consider the level of risk associated with these revenues. They're not provided up front, they're provided over time, and there's leasing challenges and economic risk that developers incurring that we account for in this analysis. So this slide provides a summary of the amount of, the amount of sales tax that the project's generating, the redeveloped component of the project is generating, and two, the amount that would potentially be shared with the project under the 1% through 2025. So that's an average of $336,000, a total nominal value of those revenues of $2 million, and a present value of $1.63 million. Through 2040, this redeveloped component of the project is projected to generate roughly $1.4 million per year for the city, or $29 million in total revenue, which has a present value for the city of $15.4 million, and represents 94% of the total revenues generated over that period for going towards the city. And so this is summary of the nominal value of those dollars and the present value of the dollars coming from property tax increment and the sales tax increment. So $6.14 million coming from property tax increment, $2 million coming from sales tax increment, for a nominal value of $8.14 million. But when you discount those back, accounting for those various factors, that closes the gap and equates to $4.88 million in present value. So that's all we had. We'll open it up to any questions council may have at this point.
So just before we open up to questions, let me just kind of tie this up into a neat wrap. So as you know, they did come to us about a year ago requesting some assistance. We, about 6 months ago, engaged EPS in this. So they worked the numbers many different ways. In January of this year, they did approach the Urban Renewal Authority and did this similar presentation to them. And then on March 19th, as Tim pointed out, the Urban Renewal Authority did approve a property tax TIF agreement with them, and within that agreement is also the potential for the cooperation agreement. And so for those new council members, this is not an unprecedented. We've done this on a few of the projects around town that create sales tax revenues. The sales tax right now gets paid directly to the city. By having a cooperation agreement between the Urban Renewal Authority and the city, it allows the city then to pass forward to the Urban Renewal Authority a portion of that sales tax revenue, which then we go to repay the debt. So what we're looking for is, right now the sales tax revenue is 3.5%. You have 0.5% of that is dedicated to a fund, so we do not include that. It would be 1 cent of the remaining 3 cents that would then go for a period of 5 years, or a little over $2 million to the developer to pay them back. So whichever occurs first, 5 years, or the total amount of a little over $2 million to them. At that time, it would terminate, and then the city would begin receiving 100% of the 3% remaining of the sales to that. So what we're looking for tonight is a consensus to return to you at a future date with a cooperation agreement. We would anticipate that the Urban Renewal Authority would approve that cooperation agreement first, and then we would bring it to the City Council for their approval at a future date. And now we can open this up to any questions, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, then we will, pardon me, turn this over to council for questionings, or council for questions. Do we have any questions? Mr. Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This may be a question for EPS as it relates to the but-for argument. You mentioned that the analysis was done solely on the parcel that's being redeveloped. How does this pro forma look with the entire shopping center included, because it is one company?
Well, we did start by looking at the performance of the entire center, and we didn't. we did that for the purposes of estimating the tax increment and the amount of property tax and sales tax charges that would be generated. In terms of the evaluation of developer return, we've really just tried to focus on the portion of the center that's being redeveloped with the assumption that this is somewhat separate from the remainder of the center. And this type of reinvestment is going to have to occur in other areas of the center kind of down the road.
What I might add is that we also looked at Hacienda, and that was an individual component. And so to keep from any double dipping or any risk of that, looking at the... Sure. To ensure that each part of the center was viewed independently, similar to the way Hacienda was viewed previously, we wanted to look at each part separately. Generally, outside our technical analysis, you know, the sum of the parts is going to be greater than the whole, and each one should perform better. While we didn't quantify that, these investments should result in an overall rising tide.
Okay, but I guess the overarching concern is that if you have a retailer like Kroger that is drawing in the majority of the people coming into the center, and those revenues aren't included in this analysis, it's all in the same boat, but you're just sort of pretending that that's not there to analyze this, and I'm just somewhat concerned about understanding the overall financial well-being of the center and its need for this a certain amount of money. And I'm not disagreeing that we shouldn't be investing in encouraging the redevelopment of this center, but when we're only analyzing a portion of it, when in reality the larger center is what drives the finances of the overall project, why wouldn't that be analyzed? I can understand the Hacienda part, but I guess one question is, as it relates to the entire project, what percentage of the leasable space is this particular parcel?
I forget the total square footage of the center.
So the total center is about 345,000 square feet. The tenants we have occupying the Walmart are about 99,000, and we've got about 14,000 feet vacant left. To your point on the King Soopers, without divulging any confidential information, you know, the traffic generation total sales of the center, you know, well north of 200 million across the center. You know, that's broken up roughly in quarters, I would say, by your major anchors. So I would also tell you that with this proposed lineup, the balance of the center, the remaining, you know, 80% of the sales tax generated from the center, I think grows over the next 20 years at a faster rate than either, obviously with a vacant building, you start losing good tenants and sales decline. So good co-tenancy and merchandising, you know, all ships rise with the tide in our opinion. And I believe there's other, you know, more inferior anchor tenants we could backfill Walmart with that would also sort of suppress the growth that you otherwise could have in the balance of the center. So if that wasn't clear in my earlier statement, that's what I was saying, why we're excited about the decision and the choice of those anchors.
Okay, I'll leave that alone for a minute, but as it relates to this being, this property being held in a partnership, who is the majority property owner? I understand you guys.
So we've got an investor called Global Retail Investors. They're a fiduciary for a state pension fund. So that is retirement money for state employees, not Colorado, but another state.
Okay.
Additional questions? Mr. Matthews.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I need to tell you right up front that I'm against a lot of the concepts in TIF. That doesn't mean that I'm discouraging you or against this particular issue. I realize I have to live in the real world, so I want to acknowledge that where I sit and where I stand, so you understand. You're asking, let me get back to basic, you're asking for $8.1 million total in TIFs. And I would direct this to Mr. Art. sales tax portion of that TIF, when it's paid, ends that TIF, correct? That it will no longer be withheld.
Ends the sales tax portion.
Yes.
Correct.
Now, does that, how are we assured of that? Because as I recall, prior to my election, the TIF ended on the Wheat Ridge Cyclery, and then there was an item came before council to allow Renewal Wheat Ridge to keep collecting that TIF for the next 17 years or whatever it was. Can that happen again?
No, the agreement will cap the sales tax amount at that $2 million.
Can they come to a future council and change that? Like
could
happened there.
The Wheat Recycler didn't change. We actually stopped the sales tax portion so that the sales tax would start coming back to the city on Wheat Recycling. Urban Renewal Authority is still receiving the property tax portion.
Okay, and that was the next part of my question.
Yes. Property tax is different. Property tax will continue going to the Urban Renewal Authority to the end of the TIF cycle, which is through 2040. The sales tax will end at 5 years or $2 million.
And what at the end of that time is the projected property tax income to Renewal Wheat Ridge?
Do you have those numbers, Tim, in the graph?
Yeah, not in this graph.
I'll take a ballpoint number if you have one.
So did you ask at the end of the sharing period?
Well, at the end of the sharing period, well, we know you're going to get
2040? It's roughly $400,000 that the project will be generating in sales tax.
No, property tax.
Property tax, sorry, that's what I meant. 400,000.
On top of the.
So you're telling me how much is going to be their share per year, ballpark number? I mean, you're supposed to, you're trying to get like $4 million or whatever it was, $6 million in property tax TIF from them, correct?
Correct.
So you're telling me though, and how long do you anticipate that it'll take to generate that $6 million?
That we're anticipating that'll take the entire term of the TIF. So through 2040, 100% of those property tax increment revenues will go to the project, and in 2040, the URA term expires and those projects go back to the
And is that based on any inflation in taxes, which we all know happens every year?
Yeah, yes, we have accounted for increasing property taxes on an annual basis.
So you were saying though that, so what was that $400,000 number then that you just gave me? For what?
That is the amount of property tax in the last year, in 2040. That's the last year of the.
Yeah, in 2021, it creates about $230,000 in property tax increment, and then that increases over by the year 2040. They anticipate that'll be about $400,000 annually.
But 100% is going to the project. The URA will not receive any property tax increment.
And does does Urban Renewal step out then when that amount is paid? That's my ask.
In 2040, yes.
Even if there's excess funds?
If there's excess, the excess will go to the Urban Renewal Authority.
That is my question. Yes. Why?
But right now, we're estimating that 100% of the property tax increment is needed for the project. If their estimates are wrong and our property tax revenues are much higher than projected, the Urban Renewal Authority will get the difference.
Okay, that is the part that gives me the heartburn. Okay,
right. Right now,
that doesn't revert back to the taxpayers at the end of the payment of the loan. I appreciate you guys' work. I do have to ask, why weren't you here a year ago? Why are we seeing this after all the URA, Urban Renewal Authority funds have been promised? It seems like, I mean, you've already got construction going out there, and kudos to you, but why weren't you here a year ago?
Good question. All I can tell you is the nature of our business and the dynamics in trying to negotiate terms with retailers and the construction cost estimates in the construction market, and really understanding where we were, how big a gap we had, the challenges ahead of us, and being able to schedule hearings and be prepared.
Okay. I mean, I have a construction background, so I understand rising costs, trust me. but I just was surprised that you wouldn't have been covering all your bases a year ago. And kudos to you for having done what you're doing. Thank you.
Ms. Davis?
Thank you. So I just want to clarify a couple items, and maybe this will help Mr. Matthews, and mostly I also want to have it heard, because I think that even if urban renewal did get a little bit of the property tax in the end, I think one of the comments saying that it's not going back to the taxpayers is not quite an appropriate statement. And I think it's because those dollars do go back to the taxpayers. So anything they have to reinvest. And I'm going to give you some examples, because I know you're sitting here looking at me like I'm nuts, but I'm going to give you specific examples of what we could do with the money and also what we've done with the money. So I think that there have been monies that we've used that have gone back to the taxpayers as a part of these TIF agreements. One of them, I think, if you remember correctly, we paid for all the damaged streetlights on 38th. Because the city, what we said was, wow, I think it was me who said, hey, I think urban renewal has some money that could pay for those streetlights that were damaged by the hailstorm on 38th Avenue. Another one is the Sprouts project, and that project was charting higher as far as revenues. So we did have some additional revenues there. And therefore, we paid for the street light that's on 32nd. That's Xenon, that's off of this property. And I think, you know, the ability, by looking at this, the urban renewal zone, this does go all along also, if I understand right, like the Kipling corridor, is that correct? So, I mean, this could be monies, again, if we're projected out higher, monies that could go towards even construction that we're talking about, that CDOT doesn't have any money, and, you know, those types of things that it is taxpayers' money, but it's going to benefit the taxpayers. It's not as if this money is going into some dark closet, and I think that we've always been very clear as far as where those monies have gone, and they have been for public improvement. So to kind of say, why doesn't the money go back to the taxpayers is a little deceiving, in my opinion, because it does go back to the taxpayers.
Just for your benefit, Councilwoman Davis and I have had this conversation on many terms, and there's kind of an ideology difference back here. I've seen studies where TIF money has been misappropriated and abused, and I'm not saying it's in this case.
Yeah, and
so I thoroughly appreciate her candor, and we will argue this point every time it comes up, so don't take it personal. And I'm fully intending to be an aye vote on this. Like I said, I live in reality.
Thank you. Ms. Hoppy?
I want the taxpayers to know that there is a potential there for money away from the taxpayers, that it's not always handled the way they would vote on.
Ms. Hoppy?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to clarify something really fast. So the 1% sales tax for 5 years, unless it's paid back earlier, will that 1% be from just this part of the project, or will it be from the entire center?
Only from the 4 new users.
This part of the project. Thank you.
Mr. Urban?
I had a question about the estimated rents that were presented. What was the $9 rent? Where did that dollar figure come from?
So we reviewed a number of the LOIs that Regency has with tenants that are all 4 tenants, I think. We didn't include those specific numbers in our materials because of confidentiality issues. But we used those stated rental rates to estimate kind of our weighted average rental rate for the center as a whole. And just this portion of the center, when I say the center as a whole, it's just this portion. And that weighted average rate was $9 a square foot.
If your part of your question is that you thought that retail rents, particularly in a center like this that has good interstate frontage, might be higher, it's well-founded because in most cases that's true. It's partly a combination of the scale of these tenants, which are larger, and you know, a small inline shop is going to have a higher rent than a large format retailer. So that's part of the factor, and then part of it is the composition of these tenants. And we were wondering that internally. There was a question we were asking internally, and we did scrutinize those LOI, letter of intent.
Okay, I'm not necessarily guessing, I'm just looking at the Regency Center's 2008 annual report, and in their 10K form that they filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission, they listed the Applewood Shopping Center average gross rent was $13.27 per square foot. So that's a significantly higher number than what we're looking at $9 a square foot. So I'm curious where the difference between $9 and what you reported to the SEC at $13.27.
The main difference in that is gross rent versus net operating income. We write leases as triple net leases, so call it a blended average of $9 triple net plus expenses. So the expenses at Applewood Village add to that $9. The tenant has to pay that. Those go to pass through to actual costs. So the net rent to us is in that $9 square foot range.
Thank you. Additional questions? I had a couple, if we're done with everybody else. You've got an out parcel down there on the on Youngfield Street, or 38th and Youngfield. What's the development potential for that? Have you included any potential revenue from that in this analysis?
We did. We negotiated retailers like Hobby Lobby Home Goods, Sierra, and Ulta are concerned with co-tenants and parking, as I mentioned before. There was a lot of negotiation on how large a restaurant we could put there, but we negotiated hard to, be able to do a large sit-down restaurant up to 8,400 square feet. So we picked about a midpoint sales per square foot number for an I think a 5,000 foot restaurant is probably.
Yeah, we've used 5,500 square feet in our analysis and just over $500 a square foot in anticipated sales, but it's an estimate at this point.
Okay, and tell me about the term that you've got, that your LOIs look to. How long are you encumbering these tenants in your initial lease and your renewals? These leases are 10-year primary terms with anywhere from 2 to 3 5-year options. So I would say over 90% of our tenants that have 5-year options exercise just about all those, the anchor tenants. And these I assume that are classified as big boxes or medium-sized boxes, and you know, everybody sees the decline in that market segment. Do you think these are viable tenants and they're going to be there until 2040?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if there's one discussion we have the most internally is just that, and picking the right retailers. These are best in class in today's day and age. So. Okay. Larry, Mr. Matthews?
Yeah, I was going to address that. In the highway business, we used to consider contractors as being in a poker game where they never got to cut, shuffle, or deal. With the decline in hard brick and mortar stores, I think you guys probably have the house stacked even against you a little higher, and I give you a lot of credit for taking the risk of what you all do for a living every day. I appreciate what's at stake. Thank you.
Do we have additional questions on this item? If not, we will conclude this item. Thank you very much for a nice presentation. Appreciate your work on this. And do we have a consensus among council to bring this back to a council meeting? We have consensus. There we go. Okay. Thank you very much. We will now turn to agenda item number 2, animal daycare and outdoor runs. And Mr. Johnstone is here with a presentation for us.
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, we provided quite a bit of information, hopefully, in your packet. It was a longish memo, but trying to set the stage for the kind of existing regulatory framework in Wheat Ridge, what we've observed based on our research of some of the adjacent jurisdictions and how they regulate commercial businesses, animal-related commercial businesses, and in particular ones involving outdoor activities. and then some recommendations or options for how you might move forward. So animal daycare, particularly when it relates to outdoor uses associated with animal daycare, are, I think, admittedly regulated fairly restrictively in the Wheat Ridge zoning code. By way of summary, in terms of animal types of uses, there are animal hospitals and clinics, which would be, we believe, inclusive of these training facilities and daycares. They're allowed in most commercial and mixed-use districts, provided, to use the language from the code, that they have no outdoor runs. If such uses would propose to have outdoor activities, they need to be located either a C2 or an IE zone district, which are really the city's most intensive commercial industrial zone districts. And then similarly, kennels are only allowed in a limited range of districts, i.e. A1 and A2, and in the ag districts, any outdoor runs must be located a minimum of 25 feet from any residential use, and there's a special use permit process associated with that. And then, by definition, in our zoning code, any boarding associated with a clinic must meet 3 requirements. It must be incidental or accessory to the main operation. It must be located entirely enclosed within a soundproof building, and it must not emit any objectionable odor. So, kind of in line with some of the comments that were made by some of the speakers, I think the intent behind those zoning regulations is really to be concerned about the potential noise impacts and odor issue impacts associated with outdoor commercial dog activities. So with that as background, whether or not the city should authorize additional locations for outdoor commercial animal-related businesses has certainly come up by a policy question of late with some of the folks that are here, one existing business and one proposed business in Wheat Ridge. And it sounds like some others that have some interest as well. So in December of last year, Council directed us to take a little further look into this in terms of research and explore specifically whether we could have a special use permit process in C1 zone districts. So we've done that research and maybe a little bit more as well. As Council knows, I think a special use permit is certainly a process that we use for a number of different uses that might be more intensive. It's an administrative process initially, but can trigger a city council review under certain circumstances, and we can talk about that if you have questions. To help inform this policy discussion tonight, we have provided in your memo a summary of how we believe various adjacent jurisdictions address these uses. And I think generally speaking, we thought that we're probably fairly similarly aligned to those other adjacent jurisdictions. Also to inform the discussion, we provided 3 maps in your packet. One maps the existing industrial and ag districts, so where these uses could go right now. The second map shows C1 zone districts, and then it also shows the residential areas that are adjacent to those. And we've also included a kind of a hatched area that shows a buffer, and what that buffer would be the 600-foot distance that would be used to notify adjacent property owners as part of a neighborhood meeting, which is the first step in the special use permit process. And finally, the third map depicts the mixed-use zoning districts in the city. A lot of our commercial properties and corridors are now zoned mixed use, so we thought it might be informational to the city council if you wanted to have that discussion to see where those zone districts are mapped as well. We're requesting additional direction from you tonight as to how you'd like to move forward with the special use permit process and in what zone districts, and be glad to answer questions.
Thank you. I will open it up to questions from council. Ms. Hoppy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So when I was going through the memo and through the presentation and through where our past presentation, I kept going, okay, so if I were for it, I'd write down all my reasons. If I was against it, I'd write down all my reasons. And I really came out at the end not really deciding where I'm at. So I guess some of my questions are really just, I would like to see if we can have a kind of a brainstorming conversation as council about, and some of the things I was wondering is, you know, if there was a separation requirement, from how far away would it be from residential zones? Or is there a mandatory screening? A number of dogs that are allowed out in the yards at a certain time? Are there maybe hour restrictions we could consider? You know, is it a license that somebody has to reapply yearly? So if they have complaints against them, then they don't get their license the next year. Like, and do we limit the total number of these special use permits specifically for this? And a lot of these thoughts for me too is, we have a lot of pieces of our community on the outlies that we're building kind of from scratch, but then we're also kind of you know, trying to build an inclusive community into our community that's already here and present. And so things that I was thinking about is, well, I do have friends who take their dogs to dog daycare every day, just like I take my children when they were little to daycare. And so I know that it's desired, and I know that my friends prefer to do something near their homes. And so like that's a changing consumer need and want as our consumers in our community are changing, and we're kind of really getting into a little bit of a more balanced between the younger just moving in, and then also the aging in place elderly. And so like I think that that's something that we should consider in this conversation. But like I said, I just didn't come out with a on top like decision, but I just really wanted us to kind of, if anybody can tell me, no, that's really stupid and this is why, I'd love to hear it. So thank you.
Ms. Davis.
So I'd like to just make a couple comments and a couple off of what Ms. Hoppe said, because I do think it would be interesting or perhaps beneficial if we look at some of the, you know, the types of things you talked about, if there's a number of dog limit or you know, within residential areas. I mean, I think those are all discussion items, and so I think those are discussion items we can have. Are those some things that we could put in requirements for a special use, or is it?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, we regulate a number of different uses in the city in manners similar to what Ms. Hoppe described.
Okay, and then I'll add just from a couple different aspects. One, from a personal note, none of these businesses, but I was hoping Lisa would be here. But I have used these similar folks before. My dogs actually went to a kind of a boot camp, and it was a intense couple weeks, 3 weeks for each of them. And it did kind of go along the lines of what some of the speakers have said. They don't, you know, you teach them not to bark, you teach them to be safe and to know how to behave, to not be reactive to other dogs, to people, those types of things. I mean, I can easily walk over 200 pounds of German Shepherds, 2 of them, down the street without a problem, thanks to folks like this. So I do think it is beneficial for our community. And then the other thing I might add is kind of going back to the daycare point, because I think that there are, now that we are becoming a little bit more, we have a few more densely populated areas. It might have someone who would otherwise have a yard might want to take their dog during the day to a daycare so that they can run a little bit. And again, I think these establishments that are already registered and monitored by other agencies are more safe for our community rather than like the Uber of dog walking. So I do think it would be a benefit to our community. I do think I would support more of a special use, because I think that it might be acceptable in some commercial areas and some mixed-use areas, but maybe not in others. But it is something I support to kind of find a happy medium for this, for for our community and for some new businesses in Wheat Ridge.
Ms. Weaver.
I want to respond to a couple things. First of all, I don't think any of your questions or questioning are silly or anything like that, because I think one of the things that, being a person who has lots of animals and they make noise, one of the things that I think we need to think about is that, and I think some of the speakers brought this up, is that kennels are different than they were even 10 years ago. And so when you walk on site at some of these places, and I have similar experiences to you, and I think the speakers brought this up, there are regulations around how many dogs, self-regulation around how many dogs that are related to each other can be together, and oftentimes you walk onto these premises and you don't hear dogs barking. So I think in thinking about, I'm an advocate of the special use as well, but I think in thinking about how we start to think about it is not taking the stereotype of what we think of as the traditional kennel, which does sort of evoke memories of barking dogs, and we certainly have those, but this is a slightly different model that I think we can create an inclusive ruling around. And I would encourage everyone to think of the things that are offensive to people, right? Smell and noise. It's not necessarily and I had this experience because a condo association that I was helping with decided to regulate based on, they regulated barking based on the number of dogs, and the number of dogs doesn't stop the barking. And so it's just thinking about what are the things that offend us, right? And how are how are these places already self-regulating because of their model, and just addressing those that may already be addressed through code as well. Could you also just take a moment? You said that you could tell us a little bit more about what special use permit and when it would get triggered to come to City Council. And could you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the SGP process applies to a number of different uses across the city in residential districts, ag districts, commercial districts, but the process is always the same. And so it starts with a neighborhood meeting. Neighborhood meeting notice goes out to people within 600 feet of the proposed location. And that's really a meeting for the business owner to explain to the public what their business model is. Staff attends those meetings, but they're really a business owner-driven process. That makes them eligible to make an application. So once you've had that neighborhood meeting, you're eligible to submit a special use permit application. Special use permit applications start out administratively. We typically send that out on a limited referral process to other departments, utility providers, fire districts, folks like that. That's a 15-day process, and then get comments back to the applicant. The community development director, in my position, has the authority to approve special use permits and also to impose conditions on them and to deny them. There's three scenarios under which they would get to City Council. One, if we receive a formal written objection that's legitimate, it can't just be I don't like Joe, then that triggers a City Council hearing. If I deny it, that would trigger an appeal to City Council, unless for some reason they just accepted that denial and walked away, which would be unlikely. Or if I approve it conditionally and they don't agree with my conditions. So they could essentially appeal those conditions to City Council.
Could the conditions be upon a code violation, or what would be an example of a condition? Or is that something that's...
Conditions would be maybe some of the things that Ms. Hoppe suggested, or others. I mean, could be hours of operation, could be the maximum number of pets in this instance, it could be a requirement to screen it in certain hours, days of the week that they can and can't operate. It could be, it's typically operational stuff, but also could be kind of site improvements that they designate, these 3 parking spaces for drop-off, or, those types of things.
Okay, thank you.
Additional questions? Mr. Matthews?
One of the things that concerns me about, and I'm not concerned about having dog kennels, but I'm just in enforcing this, is the smell factor. I know for dogs, you can hear dogs bark, and I don't know if you apply decimal standards to noise to determine what's acceptable and what's not. It's the smell factor I'm kind of curious about. My dad sold farm equipment, and as such, and part of what he sold was gutter cleaners, if anybody here knows what those are. And every once in a while he'd come home, and he and I had kind of an agreement. If I could smell him and Mom wasn't home, I'd say, well, Dad, I guess you're going to be hanging your overcoat out in the breezeway for a couple nights, and just to let him know, because, if you live with it for a couple hours, you don't smell it anymore. So what kind of standards, or how do we enforce the odor portion of the permit without being odious about it?
I don't know. I don't know if you've had any contact with we don't do the code enforcement, it's out of the police department, so I'm sure I'm guessing the issues come up with odor, but I don't know if there's an odor meter of sorts.
It's a good question. I don't know. It's part of our nuisance code, and I think it's probably a lot of discretion behind it. I would imagine. We don't use any type of meters or anything. No.
That would just be my only concern. Is, for instance, someone's wants us to be able to build one next to a residential area, and just the effect and how we maintain that without creating hard feelings all around. I myself I go out in the country. It doesn't mean anything to me to smell manure, but it's still an urban. We advertise ourselves as kind of a rural area in the middle of the urban insanity. So to me, it's not offensive, but
Mr.
for the rest of the people.
Is there sort of a standard ground finish on exterior dog play runs, or is it run a gamut, or?
Could you restate that question?
On exterior dog runs, are they typically, Kentucky bluegrass? Are they sand and gravel, or are they weeds and?
For like a doggy daycare?
Yeah.
In my limited experience, they've not been turf. They've been more of a hard surface or a gravel or a sand, something like that. But that's just based on my personal experience in a limited fashion.
Thank you. Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would be in support of allowing doggy daycares or other animal-related businesses within a C1 zone district. I think it's important, as we've learned through this process, that we're very clear about the definitions that we're using. The use of the word daycare presumes that this is during the day as opposed to an overnight kennel situation, which whether it's supervised or not, or adequately supervised, it makes it much harder to find a dog that's out in the middle of the night as opposed to during the day. Those kinds of things that pop to mind. So to Janice's point about specifics, I think we need to kind of nail that down tonight and move that forward. So I would be in favor of allowing doggy daycare facilities in a C1 zone district. I don't know what other category or metrics we need to kind of decide on as we go forward, but I think we should get that down tonight to move this forward.
Is that something, Mr. Johnstone, that you would be able to sort of come back to us with the kind of the criteria, do some research on that, and what might look like a reasonable conditions for an SUP? Is that what we're sort of looking at, Mr. Urban?
Yeah, I think that we should have some general idea of what our concerns are tonight. I would be very hesitant about continuing to look at this. I would like to see us move towards an ordinance being brought to us in short term, because we've already had one study session on this, and we kind of need to keep a short leash on this. Yeah. I've got a lot of those. I'm going to hold back on those. So.
Don't hold back.
My bark's worse than my bite, but no. I'll ask Janice to come up with any other items that we want to get clear on from everybody.
Ms. Hoppy?
Well, Mr. Urban did bring up something that I wrote down that made me start digging through my papers. I feel like one of the people who are currently hoping to see some changes in our zoning is someone who does overnight boarding, and so that's definitely something that we probably need to consider if that's something for our special use. But I guess, so I rewrote down my questions more succinctly, bullet points. If we were looking at a special use allowing special use permit in C1 and mixed use zoning, my first question is, I know with mixed use zoning, then there is another, that triggers another thing that we have to do, right, Ken?
Yeah, so when we adopted the mixed-use zone districts, certainly there was embedded in those was a fair amount of administrative review and approval, being supported by the fact that we had the embedded design standards in the guidelines. We created a concept of a conditional use, which is also just a pure administrative approval with no neighborhood notice. And that it's very similar to a special use in terms of its 4 uses that, may have greater impacts, whether that be something like a drive-through, perhaps. But we didn't want it to necessarily trigger a public hearing because we were trying to not go to that model in the mixed-use zoning districts in general. So if council thinks that the potential for a public hearing component that is in the special use permit under the 3 scenarios that I described, you'd want to evaluate whether to add that to the mixed use zoning code so that it would be triggered even if you're going to look at mixed use districts. Certainly a simple code change. You just add that language, the special use permit process, to that chapter of the code. And
would that be for all special use permits or just special use permits concerning dog daycare, boarding, training facilities?
I think it would probably be the latter, where you'd call out whatever we're going to call this as in the use chart in the mixed use districts and put an S by it instead of a C, but I don't think we'd necessarily evaluate all the other conditional use permits.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor.
Go ahead.
So my bullet points were, for a special use permit, do we want to apply conditions of the number of dogs that can be outside at a certain time, limit the total number of special use permits citywide, the number of feet from residential zones, so a separation requirement. Do we want to require specific screening? Are there open times, like outside times? Is it kind of like our noise ordinances? Is it more restrictive? Are we concerned about another thing that the mayor had asked was like the finished space? So I can see that if the space is finished, it's easier to get cleaned up. But if it's just a dirt and gravel, then that could end up with runoff to neighboring properties. And then do we want to say if they can board overnight or not? So I guess those would be my questions.
Mr. Keeter?
A couple of points. One, small sample size, but I've used these sorts of places, and generally it's boarding, overnight boarding is inside only, and so during the day they're outside and supervised, but at night then you get into the soundproof walls and all that sort of thing, depending on the location. Again, I'm a small sample size, but I'm not looking to take my dog somewhere where they're just going to be left outside overnight, because often actually there's not anybody on site overnight. And you actually have to sign something to allow the fire department to come in and rescue your dog if something were to happen while nobody's there. On the distance from residential properties, you mentioned that there's plenty of scenarios under which we enforce a buffer. Do any of those allow for a waiver? For example, if we said 25 feet from a residential property, but that residential property within 25 feet doesn't actually have a problem with it, or the business negotiates something with that property, do we have anything of that model where that buffer can be waived if the person impacted by it has no objections?
Not that I can think of.
Okay.
And maybe if I could if council would let me kind of build on Mr. Keeter's comments, and hopefully I don't misstep my bounds in characterizing some of the industry folks here, but you know, the existing Zen Doggy Daycare, you know, has represented, and I'm guessing their business model hasn't changed, but that they were first and foremost a training facility, and then secondarily a boarding facility and a daycare facility. Now that secondarily, particularly for the daycare, I think could ebb and flow just based on the business, but maybe that's something to look at in terms of, because the boarding, the overnight boarding, you know, arguably, if it's a lot of outdoor activity, could be more a traditional kennel, right? I'm not necessarily hearing that people want to change where we allow kind of traditional kennels. So maybe it's important to think of the boarding as accessory or ancillary to the daycare or training facility, but it doesn't become the kind of predominant portion of the business model. And hopefully I'm accurately characterizing that, because it's a slippery slope if we're just kind of throwing out our kennel regulations in terms of where we allow those.
They're not just hanging out.
Ms. Hoppy?
I mean, I guess I'd ask the team if, does anybody, I ask number of dogs outside at a time, does any number pop out in anybody's head on?
Is there an industry standard around this? Because it sounds like there are organizational regulations around both the cleaning of the sanitary conditions and because I know, and I don't know if this is other people's experience, but you walk in a lot of these places and you don't smell dog poop, because that would be something that would turn a customer away. So it just sounded like from some of the presentations tonight that there were some industry standards around some of these things that maybe.
For sure, and I think if the direction of council is to move forward on some of these substantive topics, we could certainly reach out to the industry and see what resources they could, you know, turn us on to inform a draft ordinance.
Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. With council's permission, could we have Julie McLean come up and maybe answer some of these, you know, industry-specific questions?
Sure, Ms. McLean, would you like to come up and we've got a few questions here. If you actually,
And if we could ask perhaps Tanya too, because I know she's done a lot of work.
and Tanya too, but
well.
so we need you to get to a microphone here.
And then Tanya, if you want to come up here. I just saw Julie from over here that she was giving us the information. I wanted to make sure she got it to us clearly.
So I think we're talking about maybe you could go under what sort of ground conditions and what the outdoor runs kind of look like. How many dogs would be out there at any time? Would they be supervised? And sort of some of the things that we've been talking about. So if you'd sort of respond to some of those.
Yeah, definitely. So PACFA regulations is no more than 15 dogs per one employee. So, I mean, my personal business model has been that's going to be long-term, no matter how many employees we have, is that only 15 dogs will be allowed in one designated area at one time. Ideally between 10 and 15, though. It's much more manageable that way. If there's multiple yards that are set up and segregated, then there could be 15, 15, 15. But again, the model is to have them be quiet out there, so we're not talking about, you know, try not to think of it as 45 dogs barking at one time, because that's outside they shouldn't be barking. That's a problem, and that's something wrong with, you know, what's being handled. As far as the turf and things like that, I mean, with daycares, there's a lot of different options. Pea gravel is definitely one. I haven't fully looked into how you clean pea gravel, but the only concern, honestly, would be urine, if anything, because regulations with PACFA, the poop is picked up right away. So a dog poops, it goes and gets picked up. So it's not, it also doesn't smell like manure. You know, I know manure travels. With dog poop, it's very close to where that area is. Typically, you're not going to smell dog poop until you are maybe a foot, or, you know, or you stepped in it. Yes, exactly. So usually you'll have to be a foot or two from the poop in order to smell it. Urine over time, which that's one of the concerns with indoor facilities, is over time when it gets in the cracks and things like that, it's really hard to get that urine smell out. But outside, the sun kind of sanitizes everything. So, so typically you're not going to find that issue. But otherwise, the other option would be artificial turf. But even, I mean, if you think of it, it's not, I mean, yes, it is larger numbers, but if you think of the way that, you know, a residential home is when you have dogs in your yard, you know, over time, even people that own dogs, they're there for 20, 30 years owning dogs, you know, their whole lives, their yards don't stink, you know, from having the dogs out there. So, so I don't anticipate that being an issue.
Okay. Additional questions? Ms. Hoppy?
I believe that somebody had said earlier that you're only allowed to have, you're not allowed to have more than 2 unrelated dogs in an area together. So 15 dogs per employee per yard times however many yards you have doesn't line up there.
No, so that's unsupervised. So in other words, if 2 dogs live together and the owner drops them off and we want to let them have some exercise time, we're allowed to leave those dogs unsupervised in a yard. But at no point can dogs be commingling together that don't live together without supervision.
Did you have something you would like to add?
Yeah, I wanted to address your question about smell. So smell is one of the things that is overseen by Wheat Ridge Animal Control. So they deal with barking and smell. So, you know, people are concerned, how do we deal with smell? So if you had a problem with your neighbor, you could contact Animal Control. The first step is Animal Control would come to your home and educate you on how to neutralize the smell, how to deal with it. The second step would be 2 neighbors would have to get together and say, yeah, we agree, it doesn't smell really great over here. And then at that point, there would be a summons where the person would have to go to court. There might be a fine, there might be some other consequence for them. So that that's addressed. There's also the Department of Agriculture. The little subcommittee is called PACFA, P-A-C-F-A, and they are very conservative and type A about precisely how we can neutralize smell. They have a very clear list of exactly how we sanitize and the order of operations for which products we can sanitize. They're very type A about the surfaces that we can use, if it's porous, if it's non-porous, how we're sanitizing turf. So all of that is already taken into account by PACFA. They also give us surprise annual inspections. They usually show up on our door about once a year, and they come out and they want to know. They literally want to put their hands on all of our cleaning supplies. What is the order? They want to look and see where all the dogs are. They want to analyze the surfaces, and they're not afraid to literally get on the ground and analyze. So those concerns are met.
Ms. Weaver?
Is this an organization that you are licensed by, or so that is something that all places like this have to have? So
Yep.
you're
You
all
can't
getting
have-
checked for those standards.
Exactly. So this is doggy daycare, board and train, training facility. Yeah, any facility that has animals in Colorado, you have to be PACFA certified.
Okay. Thank you.
So, Mr. Johnstone, would this be maybe a part of the special use permit? Is whatever state regulatory approval they would need to be, or licensure?
Certainly could be. Yep.
Sorry, Mr. Matthews, and then Ms. Davis.
Thank you. I knew I'd read something about Department of Agriculture, and that's where I was trying to head to. And then, while she was speaking, I found it here. It's in the letter from Ron Cardwell. They discuss it, and I thought it was in our notes, but it's not. So, I'm assuming we would have to make sure that we're not running afoul of state rules and regulations, that we're commingling and coordinating with Department of Agriculture then, and then so we don't get into a turf war with them.
Yes.
Thank you for asking. I actually reached out to Department of Agriculture and they wanted to be here, but their schedules wouldn't permit it. So they did say if in the future we needed them to come, to give them a heads up. So yeah, they actually want to help and thought it would be good to educate.
I'd like to add something to that. So PACFA, actually part of their regulations is to go along with whatever the city requires. So in other words, if Wheat Ridge comes in and says you're not following this protocol, then they will notify PACFA, and then PACFA will come in and say, hey, you need to do what Wheat Ridge wants you to do. So they automatically work together with the city, and if for some reason the city was like, we're shutting you down, then PACFA automatically pulls our license.
Ms. Davis?
So I think one other item that came up is around boarding, and I think that I would support it being a daycare or a board and train kind of program in these areas because, again, from being an end user, they, from my experience, they only will take your dog and board and if they're boarding them, they're training them. They're not just boarding them. So if council would consider either have it be a daycare and if it is an overnight, have it be a board and train. I know in many cases, a lot of times they'll take them home so that they'll work with them in their home if somebody rings the doorbell and those types of things. So it is an integral part of some of the programs is that these folks or these little dogs stay over and they learn life lessons. So I would support the board and train concept as well.
Ms. Hoppy?
I think I might try to take a shot at this consensus. I would like to ask for a consensus that we direct staff to draft an ordinance that allows special use doggy daycares with overnight boarding and training as an accessory, as long as it's inside only, as a special use permit with conditions of the number of dogs inside or of the number of dogs outside at a time. That to me, this should be a light use, so I don't think it should be any more than 15, which I think is heavy in residential. I think it should less. What's your number? Put your number in
I
there.
think the one thing we have to remember is this is commercial.
Yeah.
So I think
Light
it
use.
should be less. I mean, I would say 15's high. I would want to say, yeah, 7 to 10 or so. I don't, yeah.
We'll start with 10. We can make changes when it hits us.
7 to 10 outside at
Outside at one time.
Supervised.
And we limit the total number of special use permits allowed in C1 and mixed use. That limit I'll let staff guess on. That there's a number of feet separation requirement from residential zones. Again, I'll let staff get creative on that one. And that there is a available times when the pets can be outside being more restrictive than our noise ordinance times. Does that sound enough for them to? Leah?
So I just want to make a comment about the restriction on how far it needs to be from a residential property. I feel I have been more in support of a special use permit as instead of a use by right for this industry, because I feel like there are already mechanisms in place with the special use permit where we're notifying the public and the neighbors. And so I think if there were an issue, that the neighbor would be able to come and speak to it as opposed to just a flat out blanket, restriction. But that's just me. Everything else I think I would agree with.
Mr. Matthews?
Yeah, I concur with Councilwoman Dosman there, because we do have some applications and possibly some actually people in right now that are in a C1 zone, but their back property line abuts residential. We could end up maybe closing somebody down that's already existing if we're not careful. I think that's the whole reason for a special use permit, is to give people input and to, I'd hate to be that restrictive, because if you look at the map here, everything's already surrounded by residential. That could almost eliminate all permits.
maybe a setback, sort of like when, right? So it has to be a certain, like the dog runs have to be a certain number of feet off of the property line where it meets a residential, kind of like when you're building? Yeah? Okay, I totally messed that whole thing up. Do you want me to start again?
No.
No?
But you're talking about a sort of a fenced setback from the R1 district.
Yeah, but is everybody clear on what my consensus I'm asking for is, or do I need to start over? We're good, okay. Amanda?
And so what you're saying is your fence setback would be like, if this is the real fence, like their dog run fence might be 5 feet from the real fence. So they're like, they can't jump on the fence and that kind of stuff.
My only concern is what's going to happen in mixed use in the MUN, because we have living and, so I'm thinking of some of the new developments that have living above, and potentially that would be a really great thing or not a great thing to be able to drop your dog off for daycare. But what you just described would kick them out of all of that.
Mr. Keeter.
Do we want to start with commercial, see if we can get the consensus on that, and then have the discussion on mixed use?
Okay, so if we were to apply Ms. Hoppy's criteria to commercial C1 and C2, do we have consensus on that?
Can I just ask
Yes,
a question?
you may.
So I know 38th, and it's a property that one's considering is on 38th. So is that mixed use or is that commercial?
This specific property you're talking about didn't opt into the rezone to mixed use, so it is still commercial.
Okay.
It's surrounded by mixed use.
Okay, so do we have consensus on that? We do have consensus on that. Then did you want to look at this at a mixed use MUN or MUC?
I feel like Ms. Weaver's comments are like hit the nail on the head. Yeah, if you have someone living upstairs and then you have the commercial piece downstairs and then there's a setback, then maybe it doesn't work with the mixed use. But I guess I would ask staff to brainstorm on that maybe and I don't know, come up with it. I know we're asking for an ordinance for C1, but I don't know how to deal with the mixed use. What do you guys think?
Mr. Keeter?
And in the packet, you said that the conditional use and mixed use is administrative, but indicated that we could build something in to provide for this sort of similar notice and potential for hearing. Is there a way to craft something that has a similar effect in mixed use as what we're proposing in commercial?
Yeah, I mean, we just pull in a cross-reference in the mixed-use code, creating a special use category for this specific use and this specific use only. And so you'd have that notice requirement. And I guess just to add my 2 cents on, the appropriateness in MUC, I mean, I think the reason we brought it up is just because a lot of if there is kind of policy support for these types of uses, we've rezoned a lot of properties to mixed use. 38th is 95% zoned MUN, and Wadsworth through the heart of town is 90% zoned MUC. So it really is just kind of random that the properties in question are zoned both zoned C1. But it begs the question: if you're receptive to the idea, then you maybe want to talk about it. And one thought about that special use permit process. I think and some of you may know, I have kind of mixed feelings about special uses, but that's fine. But the advantage of them is that they can be very site specific, right? So if it's at West End 38, it's going to be on the first floor above 4 floors of residential. You can impose conditions on it. So maybe there you'd be less permissive in terms of location of the outdoor component. You'd be less, more restrictive in hours of operation, maybe they're not allowed to operate on the weekends. I mean, you could use that special use process to further fine-tune kind of the appropriate design of the operations.
Ms. Dozman?
So to Ms. Hoppy's point of, are we going to put a restriction on how many facilities we have or that we allow in the city? I think that if we're just talking about C1 and C2 zones, that kind of puts a good cap on, because we do have so many mixed-use properties that maybe we kind of gauge this issue starting in the commercial zones, and if we maybe need to expand it at a later time, we can talk about that. But I feel like that there are some industries that are already saturated within Wheat Ridge, and I know that we do have a lot of animal care, dog care, veterinarian type facilities, and I mean hospitals as well. And so I don't want Wheat Ridge to be like a hotbed of a bunch of dog training facilities, and I think that opening up the zoning and commercial to start with is a good place.
Mr. Urban?
Currently, we have 33 PACFA facilities in the city of Wheat Ridge, which, as you spread across the city, it's not like we're inundated or overrun with them. I would agree that starting in the C1 zone district is a good first step, because this is breaking out of the existing mold of industrial and agricultural uses. So it is a good first step towards that. And I would agree that's a little bit more difficult in the mixed-use zone district to figure out when is it appropriate, when is it not. If we were to go into the mixed-use zone district, I would wholeheartedly support the special use permit, so it isn't just an administrative decision, that there is an opportunity to object and that there is some kind of mechanism to get that input. So I would be okay with going to the C1 zone district, but as far as limiting the actual number of facilities, I don't think we necessarily need to go that far. I think we're doing that in effect by limiting it to that C1 or C2 zone district.
Ms. Weaver?
I am fine with continuing with C1 right now, and C2. I think we should expect, though, to move towards the MUN idea, because I think as we have more dense living, as we might have looked at a dry cleaner in years before, people are now taking their dog and dropping them off at a daycare, and I think that's something that's going to be an expectation with a living space.
Ms. Hoppy?
I do have one question about the number, about limiting the number of special use permits citywide, just because, like, I agree with what Ms. Dozman's saying about, if we have it just in this zone area, but we also have it in agricultural and industrial. So if you kind of look at those maps and lay them over, then that gives us a lot of actual space where they could be allowed. And it just reminds me of the public storage conversation that we had a couple of years ago, where it was because just on the other side of this black line, we don't know, but there could be, in Arvada, there could be an allowable use there. So what had happened was there was some sort of analysis of how much footage of public storage per person you need, and then we applied that to the 33,000 people in Wheat Ridge, and how many did we actually need, and did we need to allow this other public storage unit, or if we had allowed it, we would have been 10 feet per person over in what we needed in public storage in Wheat Ridge. So I wonder, is there some sort of analysis that we could look at for that to kind of monitor the number of permits? And does that make sense to everybody, kind of what I'm saying? Like, if you meld the two maps, like, it really expands into a very large area of our community where they'd be allowed.
Mr. Matthews?
I would kind of prefer to let the market dictate how many of those would apply or would be allowed. If there's a demand for it, it's mostly going to be our citizens I'm not sure if we would, why we would then cut the demand, and that would in turn, supply and demand, raise the cost to our citizens. I think we ought to let the market demand on that portion of the issue.
I would agree with Mr. Matthews, and I think we need to sort of make this a viable business opportunity. If we've got citizens that want this and business people that want to provide these, then we need to regulate it so that it's a viable business operation. Do you, Mr. Keeter?
So following up on that procedurally, my understanding was the earlier consensus did include consideration of a proposal of a cap. Is there a consensus to take that out? I'm actually kind of okay either way, whether it's having them propose something and then we can have the discussion whether we need it or not, or just not having it be part of the initial run at it. But
is there consensus to delete the cap? There is consensus.
So to maybe summarize, right now what we have is an SUP process for daycare and boarding training facilities in C1 and C2. That was yes, right? We still want to limit the number of dogs outside supervised between 7 to 10, somewhere in there. Come back with a recommendation.
Zach Urban?
Yeah, I would just ask us to focus on what the state has already determined is an appropriate number as far as the ability of an employee to handle that number of people, as well as the ability of the property to handle that as well, and leaving it at that 15 number, because whether you have 15 or 7, it takes it's only one dog that's going to be the problem. I don't see the difference between 7 and 15 somehow exacerbating it beyond the point of no return. So I think that 15 dogs, if that's what the state has determined is an appropriate number, that we should stick with that and not try to come up with our own hoop that they have to jump through.
Mr. Keeter?
I would also be interested. I don't know if the folks here can answer this on the spot, but is there a number that's commercially viable? Is there a number that in order for the business model to work that you think you would need to be able to have outside at a given time?
So my business is a little bit different. I just do a board and train, so the numbers are much, much smaller. We're actively training the dog. I'm gonna default to Julie since she has a dog training, doggy daycare.
Yes, just because of the price of rent, basically. So we need to make sure that we, have enough income to offset the high cost of the facility, and we are on about a half an acre of property total. So staying within the 15, at a time would be ideal for our profits. I would like to add that some of our clients, while most of our clients are training clients, some of them can't afford to do board and train every time they board. So I would highly suggest that we still allow an accessory use of boarding because of the fact that, they're going to be under the care of trainers, but we don't want to obligate people to be that expensive that they can't afford us when they just have, a small vacation or something like that.
Ms. Hoppy?
What is the regulations of number of yards you're allowed to have per acre or per half acre?
There currently, as far as I'm aware, there is no regulations. Their regulations is specific to one person per 15 dogs, but they don't have an outdoor parameter currently.
So let's say on a half acre, you could have as many as 3 yards with 3 employees with 45 dogs outside at a time?
So with the way, I could describe the way our property is lined out. So in our one space, we can fit 3 yards, 3 yards on that one side, 15 dogs per yard. And I think each one would be about 1,200 square feet per yard. And then we also have our back area behind the garage that could potentially be segregated into 3 separate yards as well if we wanted to. But that would be we would have a small dog section, which would be about 10 to 15 in there, and then so forth. But again, that's all up for, we can change it. There's nothing is set as far as that goes.
Ms. Weaver, did you have something, or?
I was just curious, I might have missed this. How big is the regulated yard for the 15 dogs?
They currently don't have a, as far as I'm aware, PACFA doesn't have a regulation for that.
Okay.
It's more about the number of people per dog.
I would like us to think about square footage and runs and this potential issue.
Ms. Davis.
I also want to go back to, I don't agree with the 15. I think that they're in commercial areas. I mean, if you want to run a doggy daycare with that kind of volume, in my opinion, I don't know that commercial is the right area. I think you need to go into industrial. So I think what we're trying to do is find a happy medium. And if that means that you rotate the dogs through, I mean, it's not to say that you can't have 45 dogs. It's just that, 10 of them go run for 20 minutes. You pull those 10 in, bring the next 10 out. But I think that I think 10 max is what we should allow, especially considering this is a commercial area, especially considering we're kind of on the top of the bubble as far as accepting something like this, as a lot of our neighboring cities are still requiring agricultural or industrial. So I think 10 is, in my opinion, max in commercial areas. And I do think it's a good point to bring up, again, do we still want just 10 out there, or 3 yards of 10, which is 30, So I think I want to still focus that this is commercial areas, and they might be different, and perhaps one commercial area might allow for 2 dog areas with 10 dogs each, but I think we do have to remember it's commercial.
Ms. Hoppy?
I agree with Ms. Davis. For me, the concern of looking at this as a special use permit in commercial is for light use. And if it's a more of an industrial use, then I think it needs to be in the agricultural or in the industrial zones. So yes, and square feet, if there's no state regulation on how many square feet you need to have for your dogs, of course, you don't want them to be too small, because then they'll be all up in everybody's business and they'll be mad. And I get that there's professionals that can figure out how many square feet that is, but I support Ms. Weaver's suggestion that we look at square footage per yard and Ms. Davis, number of dogs per yard outside at a time.
Do we, Mr. Urban?
I think if we were to look at the land use code, like for instance, in an R3 zone district, you can have a housing unit on like 3,600 square feet of land. So it's kind of trying to look at you can have multiple yards so long as the property has sufficient land to be able to be used for that purpose. So if we had I'm not going to throw out a number because I don't know this industry well enough to say anything, but it would have to be a certain amount of square footage available to add multiple yards. So everybody's in it. The special use permit comes with 1 yard, but if you wanted an additional one, you would have to show that you have the land necessary, because if you have a commercial zone district property with that sufficient amount of land, we're not doing much good with it anyway. So by allowing it in this use, it's making the highest and best use of that land as it is. So I don't know how staff can codify that or come up with a logical number there, but I think that would be appropriate.
Ms. Weaver?
I would encourage, sorry, let me think about how I want to say this. So in agriculture, there are horse and goat equivalents for how many you can have on a piece of land, and I would encourage, this is high intensive usage on a smaller piece of land. So I just think we should be careful about what's allowed for an hour, right? If you have different dogs every hour for 8 hours, that's a lot of animals on one small space. And so I agree with Mr. Urban of going back to some of the code regulation around how many dogs in an area. I'm hesitant to sort of say just because they have the space that there can be as many runs as can be possible on that space. Because then it would, you know, as a farmer, it would come back to me of, well, wait a minute, I'm regulated on overall my property, how many animals can be sustained on that property. And so I think we might come into some conflict of, does that make sense? So just to consider some of those larger things of what are we coming in conflict with if, because they're animals, and how many spaces can be runs.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, ma'am.
I have a question on Mr. Goff. You listed the elements of Councilmember Hoppy's original consensus. And I had written down here that what, and you didn't mention, she said the number of feet separation from residential setback.
Well, I'm not sure if we got consensus on that. The only thing that I'm confident that we got consensus on is an SUP process for daycare and boarding training in C1 and C2. We're still trying to get consensus on these other pieces.
Okay. And another one was available times that dogs could be outside, like not.
Yeah, we still need a consensus on that if council wants to go that direction. So right now we're talking about space. Do you want us, consensus for?
So those issues were not part of your consensus, Ms. Hoppy?
Ms. Hoppy?
They were, but I feel like at this point, the consensus has been edited and re-edited so much that maybe we should pull that consensus off and try to start with a fresh one that starts with allow a special use process for doggy daycare and board training in C1 and C2 zones.
We already got that.
Okay. And then we can work through
Yes.
step by step instead of me putting it out there as all at one and then it getting chopped up.
The only thing that's actually been consciously taken out of your consensus was limiting the total number. I think the consensus was let the market do its thing. So I too have the same list if we don't have to revisit them. I mean, I know you're talking about the number, but the motion said 10. The separation requirement or setback requirement as it applies to the outdoor areas and hours of operation limitations, as Ms. Shaver said. So if we don't have to revisit
We kind of
those.
backtracked on a lot of it though, so I'd like to reaffirm those.
Ms. Davis.
And I guess my question kind of goes back to what Mr. Johnstone was saying earlier, as far as the hours of operation, that will be contingent on the possible site, correct? So like you gave the example of, hey, if it's underneath, some, apartments or something, the hours of operation might be different than something that's here. So is that something that would be on a case-by-case basis, or would we at least start with the general hours of operation and then go from there when it comes to hours of operation?
You could do either. I mean, in the original consensus motion, I heard some sort of description of limitation on hours of activity in Ms. Hoppy's motion, but you could do it either way, or both.
Could we put the research on what the special use permit is on your staff as far as the things we're discussing, space appropriate, number of runs, times of usage?
Would seem like there's there's quite a bit of
separation.
There's a lot of different details to get right here, and I'm not sure that really this is the best forum to do that. Have you got enough information to go back and craft a piece of legislation, and that when we look at it in first and second reading, then we would be able to sort of adjust it as we go through the legislative process without spending an undue amount of time either tonight or in the future when we get to legislation?
Yes, and we can reach out to the industry and to the regulatory bodies and see what data points we have as a starting point on some of these issues, and then also once we have a draft ordinance, the next step in the process would be to take it to the Planning Commission for a public hearing as well, And sometimes the Planning Commission is a good body to do some of that heavy lifting in terms of diving into that stuff a little deeper and then presenting something to City Council.
So then I think if we looked at, let's leave it to staff to sort of craft an ordinance based on our discussion tonight that, you know, provides a reasonable amount of regulation and doesn't stifle the industry unduly. Is that a framework, Ms. Davis? Are you, okay, we got some consensus on that? Great. Okay. Are we good? All right, well, listen, I want to thank you all for coming and bringing this issue to us. We will roll up our sleeves, you know, and take a walk with our pet and see what we come up with. How's that? All right, thank you so much. So we will conclude item number 2, and before we go on to item number 3, we're going to have a 10-minute recess. Very much. We will reconvene our meeting at this point and go to agenda item number 3. That is the Anderson Building Programming Budget Amendment. And we have Joyce Manwaring with the Parks Department to provide us a presentation. Thank you. Please continue.
Thank you, Mayor. So in your packet, as you're aware, you have the PowerPoint presentation that we'll be going over tonight. And it really covers all the details related to our additional budget request, including a full-time coordinator to manage the building program, etc., and some of the breakdown of the budget requests that we're asking for. I want to introduce Susan Anderson, our acting recreation manager. Susan's been with the city about 25 years. She's actually been the fitness facility supervisor as well as a fitness program supervisor during her tenure here. And Brandon Altenberg is here. He's a recreation coordinator that's been working on the project as well. So, Susan, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for having me. Wanted to just talk a little bit about the Anderson Building renovation, what we've been doing for programming. We have a really great team of staff members that have been working really hard on the operations side of the Anderson Building and the pool and getting things ready to open. So we do plan on opening. It's scheduled right now for May 25th, which is on the same day that the outdoor swimming pool opens for the summer. And we are planning to start programming on Monday, June 3rd, which is 1 week and a few days after the opening. We're really hoping that we have some time to let people go in and mill around, take a look at the Anderson Building and the renovations, use the gym all day long that first week and kind of get acquainted with the new facility before we start our programming in the building, which will then limit the amount of hours that we have for drop-in. We are looking at our grand opening celebration being anywhere from mid to late June. We do have some park issues that are kind of pushing that grand opening a little bit, so we're working through those. Out with the old and in with the new. We're very excited. I don't know if you've had a chance to drive by and take a look at it, but it's gorgeous. We have that built in 1972. And you can see a huge difference between the two. I didn't have a current photo of the outside of the building because at the time it's not quite ready, photo ready yet. But that is a good rendition of what it's going to look like. The red color of that building is not quite so red in real life. So. The renovation highlights are new interior finishes on the entire interior and exterior of the building. We have upgraded storage areas. We have a closed-off storage area for the fitness area, as well as a large storage area for our gym equipment, just different equipment for the building. Our new classroom space, which used to be our my office, and 5 of our offices down there, has now been turned into a classroom space that we'll be able to offer programming in. Our fitness room and storage room is a lot like it was, just newly kind of nice facelift to that room as well. And our upper lobby area, I think one of the neatest things here, few minutes, we'll go over the check-in desk, but that check-in desk looks really, really neat, very, very artistic. And so we have changed that locker room side where the check-in used to be right there at the pull-down door, and now it's right out in that lobby area. It looks very nice. And our lower lobby area will now have a really nice seating area that is kind of cafe style. So we're looking forward to that as well. The pool renovation highlights, as you know, the outdoor pool was newly renovated a few years back. And what we focused on this time is the locker rooms. So the locker rooms have completely changed. We still have a men's and women's locker room, but we have addressed individual cabanas, and now we have 2 individual cabanas that families or individuals that feel more comfortable in a private area can utilize those areas, which we did not have in the past. We also have a brand new lifeguard office, and so that is a new building taken away from the old structure, newly built, and that has a great viewing area of the pool for watching for safety, as well as a staff break area. Our Anderson building hours, so we're pretty strategic in looking at the hours of the building. We try to have a nice mix of having the building open for new programming and current programming, as well as some designated drop-in times that hopefully will work well for a lunchtime basketball drop-in for adults, as well as an after school for the nearer schools to be able to hopefully some kids walk over to the Anderson building and play some hoops and volleyball and things like that, activities in that gym. We are looking at Saturdays having some drop-in gym time, and then the afternoon being reserved for birthday parties, rentals, which is very popular with our sports leader, athletics leader. And on Sunday, we're looking at being closed with the option for rentals for the public. We have a lot of people that are interested in renting gym space, and we have a very limited amount of gym space in Wheat Ridge for rental. So we're really hoping that people will take advantage of that time to take care of the need of the community in that way. And have slightly different hours in the, well, actually, we're looking at pretty fairly same hours for both fall, winter, spring, and then summer. In the summer, we have a little bit of difference there with no Friday drop-in because of programming, but other than that, we're pretty similar. Our Anderson pool hours are the same as they've always been. The fees, so what we looked at with structuring the fees on this new building is really having it be community-based so the community can access the Anderson building at an affordable rate in that area. And so we're looking at, for the summertime when we have the outdoor swimming pool open, just including the drop-in gym for use for that same fee that the Anderson pool is open for. And then during the school year fees, we're looking at $3 for a resident and $4 for a non-resident, and that would be all age groups. As far as programming goes, in the Anderson building, this is a nice picture of the gym under construction. Looks even a little bit different today. We are looking at some jazzercise rentals, MSSP basketball. We're really excited to be able to bring some of our middle school sports programs into the Anderson building. We've always had a difficult time finding space for practice and games and that type of thing. So we're looking forward to having some space for them, as well as just a nice variety of athletic programs that can be in the gymnasium. For the fitness room, we're looking at bringing in a few new fitness classes that we don't have the space right now at the Recreation Center to add. Insanity, TRX is an option that we're looking at for the future at this point. Parents yoga, movement tumbling, and fat loss boot camp, intermediate yoga, work, and jump around. So just a few classes that we're starting out with. The hope is to continue in the future. In the classroom space, so this is that brand new classroom space that we didn't have before that we're really in great need of. We have our birthday parties that we can have in there, some kid creation corners, a clubhouse which can help with our teen population and our tween population, as well as some different specialty camps and a preschool, wee school class. This room also has the capability of being licensed if we decided sometime down the road to put a licensed program in there, but right now we're looking at more of the general program type classes. So moving on to the budget, what we're looking for here, we have a total expenditures for the rest of 2019, opening this building the end of May, of $121,569. And in that is including staffing, which, as Joyce mentioned, is one FTE, recreation coordinator, to run, plan, organize the building, and some miscellaneous benefits that go along with that, as well as intermittent staff, which include building supervisors, a gym attendant, and custodial staff. And these would be hourly custodial staff. We're looking at a supply budget just for this last half of the year of $2,150. And we have our contract custodial budget, utilities and maintenance, at 23. And what we're looking at there with our contract custodial, that is to remain the cleaning of the locker rooms year round. we're looking at keeping those locker rooms open year-round so people who are playing basketball and getting sweaty when they're coming from work and going to work and that type of thing, that they have a place to get cleaned up afterwards. And we're looking at revenue projections of $24,000, and we're hoping that our rentals, which includes Jazzercise and the rentals there, other possible rentals would be sports youth groups, different things like that, basketball teams renting the gym to practice with their teams. And so we're kind of looking at around $13,000. And our fall, winter, spring admission fees, we're hoping that we will get about 20 youth adults in the building just in those few hours of drop-in time that we have per day. And that puts us at about $10,800. So our supplemental budget request is $121,259, and we had an approved budget of the $31,349. So we're asking for a supplemental budget request of $90,220. We would be happy to answer any questions that you guys might have at this time.
Okay, thank you very much for that presentation. We will open it up for questions from council. Ms. Davis.
So I have a couple questions. One, those fees are very reasonable. And I guess when I have to go somewhere else and pay a fee, I usually am targeted a little bit more than $1. And I guess my question would be, you know, is there any consideration for, you know, like if I go play a Fossil Trace golf course, if I'm not a Golden resident, then I pay considerably, of course it's golf, but I mean, it's not a tiny bit. So I guess, and this might be what you guys are doing, but is there any reason why we wouldn't make that a couple dollar change? I mean, it's just my thought, because again, our dollars and our tax dollars are going towards these, and I think the same thing, we run into the same thing at the Wheat Ridge Rec Center. I talked to a bunch of people that aren't Wheat Ridge residents that go there, and we're happy these folks use these facilities and stuff, but I mean, I appreciate that they're reasonable, but I feel like they should be a little more.
I'll let Joyce answer that question.
We can make those adjustments in the fees. There's some, I guess there's a philosophy about just to make the point that there's a difference between resident and non-resident. It's not going to bring in a great deal of revenue, and it's going to be difficult to implement when we're talking about youth drop-in at the pool using both the swimming pool. But we can certainly look at that and make that adjustment.
So what would be difficult to implement?
They don't always have an ID.
Oh, an ID, well.
So, but we can certainly do that. Yeah. Our real goal down there is to provide a drop-in facility for the neighborhood. But as the building evolves and we see how the usage is, we'll know if we're getting a lot of out of the area kids that aren't necessarily walk-in traffic. Mm-hmm. But I believe the initial usage will be from the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
And we do have a tiered pricing at the rec center for out of Wheat Ridge residents.
Yeah, is it $1
yeah.
though?
I don't know how much different it is.
I mean,
it's more than $1.
It's more than $1.
Yeah.
And also thinking about the service that we're really offering is a drop-in gymnasium to shoot baskets, whereas some facilities you're going to get a little bit more. You can swim, climb the wall. You know, you're in an elite golf course when you go to Fossil Trace. So.
Additional discussion. Turn this on. Mr. Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Do the revenues include any field rental or other Anderson Park related fees that may be generated?
Not in these figures. These are just for the building usage.
And so would there be additional costs relating to the rest of Anderson Park? And I guess just
absolutely. We'll still have our standard shelter or picnic pavilion reservation fees. Mm-hmm. The one at Anderson is on the same tier as the one at Prospect Park. So that's a larger, higher fee rental, $100 to $200, depending on your residency again. And then the park ball field rental fees have been evaluated, and that's by the hour. So to rent the baseball field with lights is an hourly rate. And those revenues go in two separate revenue accounts and are offset with the athletic program budget.
Okay.
So with our program budgets, the Anderson Building, it has a revenue account, and
It's
the
separate.
athletic program does as well.
Right. And then as far as the situation with Jazzercise, why would the lease say they can't use a water fountain? What's that?
You know, that was a surprise to me as well, so I'm going to check that out. I have no idea if there was, why they wouldn't be able to use a water fountain. There's a very nice new water fountain down there with a bottle filler. So I'm confused by that as well.
If I may interject on that one, I think it was just part of the lease that they can use. That was a benefit, is that they can use the water fountain. When she was just surprised that would be in there, since you don't, her time's been cut, but I'll address that in a minute. But I'm not sure that was an issue. It might be a
I
misstatement.
misunderstood then.
So did I then, but I would just encourage us to work as much as we can with Jazzercise, and I'm not quite clear what the genesis of not allowing Jazzercise to come back in. Could you recap exactly why, what the situation there was?
Well, when the Anderson Building was in the condition it was before it was renovated, it was only open for programs as scheduled, and Jazzercise over the course of time had been allowed to have a key to the building and offer their program 2 times a day, and it was really taking about 4 hours of the program time. So when the building was renovated and the recreation management team did a comprehensive look at what programs were needed and what could be offered, Jazzercise was taking up too much of the time Monday through Friday and Saturday morning. So as you know, we reached a compromise and offered them their morning time. All of our programs start 15 minutes before the start class time and 15 minutes after. We can certainly extend that time and take a look at it, but I hadn't received any communication that that wasn't adequate.
Okay.
So they were using 2 rooms, one for babysitting and one in the gymnasium. And they were coming in, registering people ahead of time. We're just asking them to operate more efficiently and pay for the time they use. And I'll go ahead and address that that we try to be our policy. We don't try to be, our policies are fair and consistent across the board for all user groups, because if you set up a separate situation for one user group, we're really not fair to the other user groups and our other residents. So Jazzercise is a private business. It's a trademark business, and we consider them a private rental. And they had the Anderson Building as kind of a Jazzercise center for themselves. And we're just asking for more compromise and for them to pay for the time they use. And I see them the same as any baseball group that uses the field. They pay by the hour. So.
Right, and I guess just my perspective on this is that what is the opportunity cost of Jazzercise not renting that facility? What would we be otherwise receiving in revenue? And I'm not so much concerned about being fair to various groups and being more fair to the taxpayers. And if we have a consistent and long-term tenant, that's worth more to us than a intermittent tenant or an intermittent user on something. And so we kind of have to look at both sides, that yes, if we're not treating one group exactly the same as another, there must be a reason for it, and that reason may be their long-term commitment or a longer lease or some other type of reason why we are treating one differently than the other. And I think that at a rate of $3 or $4 for a drop-in gym, how does that, I guess my question is, how does that revenue compare to what Jazzercise would be providing during that same time?
I wouldn't compare a drop-in gym fee for youth with a private Jazzercise company for adult women. They pay different kinds of fees. If we don't rent the facility to Jazzercise, we'd program it ourselves.
But what would be the revenue difference between programming ourselves or?
It would either be similar or it'd be greater if we programmed it ourselves.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Hoppy?
Much like with what was going on with the doggy daycare, our community is changing, and we have a lot of facilities and programming for adults. We don't have a lot for our youth, and often when I'm in the community, I hear a lot of people say, well, where are our youth programs and what do we have? We do have some at the rec center, but it's not expansive. And now my two older girls are like older now, but when they were like tweens and teens, there really weren't very many programs for me to send them to. And so like a drop-in gym space would be great. This does things that also helps kids be active and off the streets. And I would say that the value of that in our community is heavier than just the revenue you could pull off of it. But I'd also like to just point out that in our strategic plan, we have a few bullet points that go along with this new programming. Families have access to resources for physical and mental and emotional health and well-being. Well, this is an inexpensive way for families to go and play a game of basketball together. Another one of our points was Wheat Ridge residents enjoy an active, healthy lifestyle through recreation programs and services that are responsive to unique needs of each generation. So it's about balance. We need to be able to find some balance between our youth and our adult programming. And then we have a specific goal, which is to increase young family participation in city-sponsored recreation programs. It's under Strategy 8.1.1. And so this is really working towards our strategic goals, and I think it's important, and I understand that it's hard to find that balance, but at this point, as a mother of 4 children in this community, I feel like our youth programming is kind of lacking. And so I just really want to say thanks. I do appreciate that you guys have, brought this to the table.
Mr. Matthews?
Thank you. I've got some other questions. Since we've been talking about the Jazzercise, I will stay on topic for just a few minutes. Jazzercise, as I've been told, has been there for about 30 years. And they've got about 100 women that come. And I've heard comments that we have too much programming for women. And I'm not sure how we have measured that. Just a couple months ago, when we were talking about the baseball field, someone came up to that podium and said, well, baseball's just for old white guys and we don't need it. And now I'm kind of hearing a exercise program that's been around for 30 years is just for old women, and why do we need it? Besides the fact that they've been coming for 30 years and been a steady revenue stream for us. The other advantage is that many of them come from outside the city. And, we pay 2020 $500,000 a year to try and entice people to come to our city, and here people are coming voluntarily without having to be entertained per se and paying money to be here and spend time in our city. And and those 100 women, according to a note I've got, would say that they do, while they're here, run errands and spend money in our city. I guess I'd have to ask, based on my understanding, they spend about $8,400 to $10,000 a year renting the Anderson building. What do we have to replace that revenue that's on the books right now while you're asking us for $90,000?
Well, we would program some other type of fitness programs in the morning and have class revenue. I don't have a number off the top of my head. I think we have a nice balance of programming. I don't believe any of my staff ever said that Jazzercise was, not a valid fitness program for women. It certainly is. We're just asking that, and I do believe in consistency and fairness for all our rental user groups, because I answer to those groups when I have a special situation. And there may be 100 women in the program spread over right now at least 2 classes a day and Saturday. So that's a total of all of their classes. It's not per class.
No, I didn't say. I just said there's about 100 participants that come into our city from the outside. Many of them from the outside.
Right, and we're happy to have Jazzercise there. We feel like we've reached a nice balance by offering them those morning time slots.
Okay, well, the situation as I as it's been explained to me, and I'm afraid Missy doesn't do much for herself as a public speaker, but cutting their time in half means she probably can't come at all. So your 10 grand a year revenue's gone. They will not be coming to the center, plus the other restrictions, not allowing them to store their equipment on site. So every week, every day, every class, she's got to unload, pull stuff in, and it's stuff that we keep on, that we, that we used to let them store on site. So we removed that from their ability. So the bottom line is, based on the last information I had, they're not going to sign a lease with us. So as I said, we're sending $10,000 or $8,400 to $10,000 a year away, and I'd like to know what our plan is to replace it before we send it away. But what we've done is, in our compromise, is given them an untenable business model that they can't live with. It's not what I call a compromise.
Well, I believe that's why they have business jazzercise centers, which they do, and I don't feel the Anderson building can accommodate that. We no longer have the storage room that we once had to allow them to store all of their equipment and stage inside the building. So we're trying to do the best we can to be a fit for them, and that's what we've offered them. In terms of the revenue, we'll have to build a program back to replace that, and I believe we can do that. I don't have an immediate answer for you about what class is going to produce the same type of rental revenue, but we'll work to make sure that we create revenue for the building in the same way we do at the recreation center.
Okay. Good luck. I have some questions too. You're asking for $23,000 in contract custodial. We've not increased the size of the building at all. Why is there something in the budget for some of these items already? And who, we're asking for a recreation coordinator and a miscellaneous intermediate building supervisor and gym attendant. Who's done these tasks in the past?
We haven't had any staff down there. If we had a person, for example, the jazzercise instructor had a key to the building. If we have a birthday party in the gym, our birthday party leader has a key to the building. So now we have a new desk in the upper front lobby. Well, let me back up again. The locker rooms to the outdoor pool were never open in the wintertime. So we're now requesting dollars to keep those locker rooms open so they can be used year-round. We would like to have a building supervisor to monitor the building while there's a program going on. We need custodial services to clean the locker room, plus part-time janitorial to back that up.
Is the recreational coordinator going to be on site?
Not right now. We're not planning to have the recreation coordinator on site.
So what you're saying is our coordinator that we already have for Anderson building or whatever in general for parks can't handle the Anderson building. We need.
They aren't the same jobs to pay a part-time building supervisor to monitor the building from 8 a.m. until 8 p.m. at night as the same as having a professional recreation coordinator that schedules that person, recruits, trains, hires, manages the software program, the computers, schedules the building, and creates programs to put in the building. So they're two different things.
And the custodial maintenance, we haven't been doing that, or is there money?
We've been doing it with a part-time hourly custodian.
And that's going to turn into?
The more the building is used, the more it needs to be cleaned.
Okay. Is there a reason this wasn't anticipated in our November budget 6 months ago?
Because we start preparing that budget in June, and we weren't ready.
Thank you.
Mr. Urban?
Recently, we had a contract come before us regarding custodial services for the entire city buildings. Does this building is not included in that contract, or how is that building included in the contract we approved for?
Susan, do you remember if the Anderson building is included?
Use your mic.
It is during the summer, so that's what we had in the current custodial contract, a summer locker room cleaning for the outdoor pool. At the time we started the contract, the locker rooms being open year-round wasn't a part of that contract.
So is this amending that contract, or is this a different service that we're using for these services?
We'll be amending this contract to add this service.
And I guess is it like on a per square footage basis that they're basing that amount on, or how do we determine that that contract amount, that this 23,000? What percentage of the 23,688 is for the contract custodial versus utilities and maintenance? Or
Do you have that number, Susan?
Okay, so the custodial contract for cleaning the locker rooms year-round is $10,050. We have utilities in on that number as well, which is $9,400, and our facility maintenance is a total of $1,990.
Okay. As far as the intermittent building supervisor, to quote Office Space, what's their job? I mean, what are they doing in that capacity versus just like checking people in, or what's their role there?
Monitoring the building, monitoring the program. It's similar to a guest service attendant that you see at the recreation center behind the front desk when people come through to use the building. So they'll pay a fee if it's only a program scheduled in one of the rooms. It's really, from a safety liability standpoint, we need a building supervisor because the person leading or running the program really can't watch what's going on in the rest of the building when they get behind a closed door. We often have gymnasium, when there's drop-in gymnasium. Right now we have money that we may or may not find we need for a gym attendant because people fight in the gym when they start playing basketball, and you have to have a supervisor to break it up and monitor that. So that's what that person will be doing.
So I guess my concern is that we've got all this time without a referee in the gym, and we've somehow made it. Like we're still here.
We don't offer drop-in basketball at the Anderson Gymnasium right now.
Well, maybe not that particular activity, but the Anderson building has withstand the elements and the people coming and going for over 40 years now without the need for a super.
I guess it's if you wish to have your investment in this recreation center be a small community recreation center that's open to the public from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., it will cost some additional funds. If council would like to close the doors and have them locked most of the day, unless there's a program scheduled, and then when there's a program scheduled, if you'd like to have the leader lock the door behind them, then the parents can't get in to pick up their kids at a birthday party, at a fitness activity. We can run the building that way. It's really your choice, but we're going to need some additional funds if you want to see it operated as a small recreation center for the community. We have a lot of children in that community, I believe, that would benefit from being able to walk to this center and participate in the youth programs that we're hoping to offer there, as well as our expanded fitness program. Because we're out of room at the recreation center. We know that we have the demand there. So that's what we are offering to you if you would like to offer that to your community. If not, we'll just lock the door and do what we had done before for around $50,000 to $60,000 a year.
Ms. Davis?
So I would just like to add, thank you for that clarification. I think it provides more clarification of the scope of services have expanded. And I understand Mr. Urban's question about, well, for 40 years we haven't had this. But I think from a liability perspective, I think we run into this in all kinds of businesses. It's a liability, or we haven't had a problem until. And it only takes one until that's going to cost you $1 million in a lawsuit or something versus having an attendant. So I mean, I think that if we are having more activity there, there needs to probably be someone there. Now, again, I mean, you hope there's no fights, you hope there's no, you know, damaging properties and those kinds of things, but it's until when something happens that you wish you would have spent the dollars to have somebody there rather than not have somebody there, and it's going to cost you a lot more. So, but I appreciate the clarification on some of that.
Mr. Goff?
I was just going to clarify that too. I think Ms. Davis did a fine job, but maybe some of us are missing the point that, I mean, this center's going from a closed locked center to a 12-hour a day center that's going to be open, and you need the staffing for that. And, you know, I think it's important to remember what the ballot question was too. You know, we're spending, the ballot question was for $4 million for improvements at that building and the park, but we're spending probably over $5 million, right? Over $6 million with other funds. But it was improvements to Anderson Park to provide upgraded renovation amenities and facilities that enhance recreational opportunities that meet the current needs of park and facility users. So, you know, it was our intent to make sure that this building could be used by the entire community and for different programming, not just a jazzercise program. But again, as Joyce said, if that's the direction that council wants to go a different direction, we can change that, but this is what we're recommending.
Ms. Dozeman?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Is your announcement public yet?
Yes.
Okay, so I just wanted to congratulate you on your retirement, and I wanted to thank you for all of your hard work. I've worked closely with you with the Carnation Festival, and I think you've been a great steward of our Parks and Recreation Department, so I want to thank you for that. As far as this, I do have a couple questions, but I want to kind of make some comments about an end user and having lived within a couple blocks of this park. It's my neighborhood park. I have swam here for as long as I can remember. So I really appreciate the improvements and it moving more in the direction of being a family recreation center that's open, because the bathrooms there at the park have been there since as long as I can remember, and it's you know, a little unfortunate that we didn't have access to the bathrooms during the spring and winter, and I love seeing the programming, like kids and parent yoga. I've actually been looking for classes of that nature for myself and my children, and I really appreciate your thorough presentation, and I'm so glad to see one of our longstanding parks and rec buildings be renovated. So I think this is a great ask, and I can't wait to see it open and be a user, not just during the summer. But I did have a question about the prices. Let me try to find the slide here. So why are we not doing the same kind of pricing during winter, spring, and fall? Like, what was the decision behind?
We're trying to simplify that if a participant visited the outdoor pool, that they would be able to also go into the gymnasium, because that's really the only other room available. So we didn't really want to recommend that they pay $5 to do go swimming and then have to turn around and pay $5 to go into the gymnasium. So it's not something that we currently have a lot of flexibility with at the recreation center. It's obviously, there's a fee to get in, and there's several parts and pieces of the building. This is much simpler. We're really trying to reach out to the youth in our community that maybe can't afford to be in the recreation center on a daily basis.
That's great, yes, because I feel like a lot of the youth programming is lacking. I've always wondered why we don't have sports programs for our young children. I mean, I grew up playing softball, and I know that Wheat Ridge girls softball still exists, but we don't have a t-ball team. We don't have a youth baseball, basketball, soccer team that's based in Wheat Ridge. Are you considering charging adults a higher price? Because you have adult and youth pricing for the summer, but it's all ages. Is that kind of one of those like simplifying factors, and you anticipate more youth users?
Well, I think we have the program labeled as youth drop-in basketball, so not recommending that we mix adults with the youth. We could take a look at family drop-in, you know, adults accompanied by children, but we don't tend to mix.
Okay, that was a good segue, because one of my next questions was going to be, is it going to be segregated from youth and adults? Like, so we won't be having adults and youths on the basketball court at the same time?
I think we're going to have to take a look at that. That may not be something we thought about, because if a parent is there with their child and they want to go in together, we want to accommodate that. So we'll take a different look at that. There's a different fee for adults already at the outdoor pool, so we'll just take a look and see how that might end up being programmed. We just want to make sure that our kids are safe, and if there's adults in there, it's probably going to be more family and youth, not adult drop-in, unless you're with your child or a young person that you want to play basketball with.
Okay, and I just maybe need to ask this for the sake of the Carnation Festival. Are we on a good timeline to be finished and open and everything ready?
We are. So I'll just do a couple side notes. You know, the rendering that you saw in the picture, that was a conceptual rendering. The building doesn't quite look like that. There aren't those windows in the front. There are windows, but based on where the support beams were, et cetera, we don't have that garage door look that we had once hoped for. And then, yes, the building is definitely on track. We expect to have that finished up with staff in there training in mid-May at the latest. And then for the opening, as Susan mentioned, on Memorial Day. I'd like to have both of them on Memorial Day. The park, based on the weather this winter, has suffered its construction schedule because of that. We've already missed a deadline for sod, asphalt, a lift of asphalt, et cetera. But they're pushing. We've got a great contractor, and we're now really, Patrick and I have had discussions about, well, when's the best time to have a grand opening, and I'd really like to have the playground completed, the public art project completed, the sod down, and the performance stage finished. Our baseball field lights are up and installed, and we're working on rehabbing the interior of the baseball field right now. So hopefully we'll get moving here and there won't be any more snow, because that's really held them back on schedule.
Thank you. Additional questions, Mr. Matthews?
You mentioned that you had storage for your fitness equipment. Are you planning on having fitness classes there? And I'm just curious, other than these drop-in windows, how much of the programming time has been filled so far for June, since that's closely here?
We have a separate fitness room. We always did. It was the room to the left, and there's we built in a storage area that to hold the fitness equipment, and that'll be able to be shut and locked. Susan has a program that's hour by hour, and there are a few gaps in that, but I don't know, Susan, would you like to address the rest of Larry's question, Councilman Matthews' question on what is programmed for June?
Yeah, so we have our summer activity guide, which is out, and we have programmed June, July, and August. And then with September, our fall guide will cover that. And so we have a lot of classes that were currently held there, as well as have added youth karate, adult karate to that schedule. Those are some of the evening classes that we have in there. And some of the new fitness classes that I spoke of, the work, insanity, those are all classes that we'd like to offer at the Recreation Center, but we just don't have any more space in our aerobics room to offer. So that having these additional time slots in that fitness room is going to really help with that.
Thank you. I had never intended, by the way, to say we shouldn't utilize our facility. I was questioning if we should shut part of it down before we really have the income to replace it. That was my basic question. I think we need to utilize that. It's been underutilized for years, and we've had rumors about needing to expand the rec center. I think this gives us an opportunity to take some of the pressure off the rec center, and I think it's going to be a valuable addition to the to our overall parks program.
Thank you. Ms. Weaver.
I thank you for the presentation. I'm just super excited to have something focused on youth, because I just think that's so needed in that area, and in that area of town. And I just want to sort of reinforce the idea that you do need a full-time person there, especially when you have youth and drop in. And I'm just super excited about this. So thank you, and thanks for your presentation.
Okay, Mr. Urban?
As far as the revenues for the facility, we talked about daily fees, but is there any membership package or bulk rate or other kinds of fee structures that would allow more residents to buy a summer pass or a season pass or some other kind of mechanism there, and what would that do to the revenue?
Well, we don't have revenue projections out, but the revenue at that building, even if you think about the revenue at the recreation center, you're always going to subsidize the operation of that. We're not going to be able to collect enough revenue to offset the cost of operating the building. Taxpayers will always subsidize the operation of the outdoor pool, the active adult center, and now the Anderson building. And they will, the Wheat Ridge Recreation Center as well. We've done a great job with revenue there, but we have been using our fund balance, as you've been aware of. So we can certainly look at a season pass to use the Anderson building. We have different marketing packages that staff puts together based on their knowledge of what people are looking for, so we can take a look at that. We obviously have season passes at the outdoor pool. We've done different combinations of passes for the indoor pool, the outdoor pool, the recreation center, so we can take a look at that. Generally, that provides revenue without usage. Drop-in fees provide revenue equivalent to the use of the building.
Right, and I guess my reason for bringing that in is if we could have concessions, or if we could have equipment rental or other ways to generate revenue from the square footage of that building, because as it stands, we're only talking about like you said, we're only asking people to pay for what they use. If we allow a season pass or other, we're getting in more revenue for less use, and that helps reduce the subsidy provided by taxpayers. And I'm not indicating that I have some magic bullet to fix that revenue equation with respect to the rec center. I get that the taxpayers had committed to subsidizing that activity because that's what they want in their community, but on the other side of it, we have to do everything we can to maximize the revenue out of there. And like Christy said, as far as the non-resident members, a point-of-sale system can easily, give us your zip code, or give us, if they don't know their zip code, why are they there without their parent? It should be something that it should be fairly easy to ascertain whether they live here or not. I'm not asking people to interrogate some youth about where they live, but they're usually not the ones paying. It's going to be a parent or somebody else. So I don't. Okay. Well, I would say on the whole, I'm not talking about every instance, but I think that if a kid is walking to the rec center, they're probably within Wheat Ridge. So there's got to be a better way to do that. And I think that charging non-residents more than $1 more than what we charge residents is somewhat reasonable. We should be charging them a little, I don't know what the percentage is, but the non-resident fee should be higher than the resident fee.
Okay, we'll certainly take that direction. And I want to clarify that square footage and the revenue you're seeing, because of the way the city has their budgets set up, their program budgets. So if there's an athletic program in the gymnasium, the revenue goes to the athletic program, not the building. The fitness room, same thing. If there's a yoga class in there, or a handbell class, or not handbell, kettlebell class, then that goes into the fitness program budget. Yeah, that's an idea. Let's do handbells. So, you're not really getting an accurate picture, because that isn't the way our budgets are set up to represent all of the revenue created by having that square footage. Does that make sense? You're just seeing the drop-in number. Every class fee for every program that's held in there, there's revenue associated with that above and beyond just the fee. As you know, we charge generally 30% more than the cost of the class, but that revenue is not represented in this presentation, and it isn't represented in the budget. It goes into the program budget of fitness, athletics, whatever the program is.
But yeah, I guess as we're looking at this, then it's difficult for us to make a judgment call on the expenses that we're expected to pay without understanding the full revenue that we're receiving in. It's trying to ascertain what's the what is the true gap here. Is it that 24,000 and my computer's locked up here, but trying to ascertain the true gap here is difficult when it is bifurcated in that way. So, I would feel uncomfortable approving this without kind of understanding what's the total revenue generated from the Anderson building and what are the true costs. But other people might feel differently.
I can certainly get all of the revenue from all of the programs and recalculate it in that manner, but it isn't going to be presented that way in the budget per se. The only time you really see that number is with the Active Adult Center because it's a building and a program.
I've got Ms. Hoppy, Ms. Dozman, and Mr. Matthews in that order.
Okay, well, I'm going to try for a consensus, and so I'd like to find consensus for supplemental budget appropriation in the requested amount of $90,220 for 2019 to fund those additional expenditures at to enhance recreation services at the Anderson building.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have consensus on that. Ms. Dozman?
I was just kind of going to bring the conversation back to, how much money it costs to renovate the baseball lights and the conversations that we had, how the baseball field does not pay for itself currently and will not pay for itself. And we didn't cry a river over spending that kind of money on something that the community had, come out and said that they wanted a different use. So I think that what we have here in the supplemental budget is appropriate to what the community has asked for, is what we have gone and been in line with as far as the council goes and with our strategic plan. And so I thank you for coming and asking it, and I definitely support it.
Mr. Matthews?
Yeah, I'm a little concerned. This is on topic but off topic because the way we're reporting income. It seems like, for instance, like Jazzercise, we charged them rent to use our facility. It appears to me that we should be charging ourselves rent to use the facility. If we put a class in there, we are generating wear and tear on the facility, and that should be expensed somehow back to the facility. A contractor owns a piece of equipment, but he charges himself rent on that piece of equipment because someday he has to replace it. I mean, he's got a cost. He spends $100,000 to buy a tractor hoe. Someday he's got to replace that ownership cost, or he'll go broke. I mean, water board aside, because they say they already own it, so it doesn't cost them anything, and then they expect taxpayers to buy it. But it seems like we should be somehow, I mean, you say you need more custodial.
It is, and we do. You're just not seeing that number by program budget. We do charge ourselves to use the building. We charge ourselves to use the field. Our soccer players pay the same fee on a program we run as Wheat Ridge Baseball. So we do all of that. It's represented in the way we charge the fees.
But do you show that coming back against the building? That's my
question. That's not the way our program budgets are set up. We show it coming back to revenue to the program budget. So we're having a philosophical discussion about how our budgets are set up. I'm just assuring you that what you're stating does happen. The fees are set up that way. We do take into account what it costs us to operate a building. In fact, we're getting even better at it in terms of identifying those costs and knowing what it costs to run a gymnasium, to run a ballroom in the recreation center. So we're identifying those fees and we add them to the cost. You just don't see it when you go through your budget and you see the Anderson building. You're not going to see the revenue, all of the revenue associated with the square footage in that revenue line. And so what we've represented tonight is the way we have our budget set up, the drop-in fees and rentals.
I'll save that for budget deliberations.
Ms. Dozeman?
So I just have one quick question. You do offer a pass, right? Like you can buy a supplemental pass for the summer for the use of the pool in the Anderson building, right? Or are we not offering that any longer?
I'm going to have to check on that. It's had varying degrees of success, so I'm not sure if that's offered this year or not.
Thank you. Have we concluded item number 3? Thank you, and thank you for your work on behalf in our city.
Oh, thank you.
You've done a great job, I think. So that concludes all of the agenda items. We'll move now to staff reports. Mr. Goff.
I think that's it for this evening.
Okay. We'll then go to elected officials matters. Does any elected officials have anything they'd like to say tonight? Well, thank you all for very much. If that is there any more business to come before council at this study session, we will stand adjourned. Thank you so much, and see everyone.